Chapter 1. The Crimson Court. The Betrayal and the Beginning of War. The fortress of Drakenhold loomed over the border princes like a monolith of dread, its jagged towers clawing at the storm-laden sky. Carved from ancient obsidian and reinforced with blood magic stone, it was a fortress unlike any other, a place where mortal invaders seldom dared to tread, and where the Undying ruled with absolute dominion. Inside, the great hall flickered with the glow of witchlight torches, casting long, twisting shadows across the assembled knights. The air was thick with the scent of old blood and damp stone, and the whispers of those long dead seemed to coil through the vaulted ceilings like restless spirits. At the head of the war table, clad in black and crimson plate, Lord Varos the Crimson Fang sat like a spectre of war. His presence alone commanded obedience. His eyes burned like molten embers, his fangs gleamed beneath his sharp features, and his every movement carried the weight of centuries spent honing his craft upon the battlefield. To those who followed him, he was not simply a lord, he was a legend, a disciple of Abhorash himself. He drummed his fingers on the cold stone table as he regarded the gathered knights before him, 30 of his finest warriors, each a blood dragon of renown, some as old as the Sigmarite Empire itself. Their crimson armor glistened in the torchlight, battle-scarred and dented from centuries of conquest. At his right hand stood Sarion von Vargeist, his second-in-command, a towering figure clad in midnight black plate. His features were sharp, his pale skin stretched tight over high cheekbones, and his golden eyes held a cunning intelligence that few could match. Unlike Varos, who carried himself with the proud discipline of a warrior, Sarion had the grace of a predator on the hunt. Sarion was speaking, his voice a low growl. "The warlords of the border princes gather their strength," he said, his fingers tracing over a map of the region, his gauntleted hands casting spidery shadows over the parchment. "They see us weakened by our own stagnation, our lack of conquest. They test our borders, picking at the edges like jackals, sensing weakness in a wounded beast." Varos exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "Let them test," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a blade sliding from its sheath. "They will find no weakness. Dragonhold has stood for 3 centuries. It will stand for another 3. A murmur of assent rippled through the knights, but Sarion did not look satisfied. "You are blind if you believe that, my lord," he pressed, his gaze meeting Varol's own. "The mortals know fear, yes, but they also know ambition. We let them grow unchecked, and they will gather the strength to burn this fortress down. The others," his eyes flickered toward the assembled blood dragons, "they grow restless. We should be waging war, not waiting for it to come to us." Varos narrowed his eyes, studying Sarion. There was truth in his words, but something else lurked beneath them, something off. A quiet hunger, a coiled serpent behind his measured words. Varos turned his gaze to the rest of his knights. Some shifted in their seats, their fingers twitching on sword hilts, others nodding subtly at Sarion's words. A few watched in absolute stillness, the silence between them heavier than the stone walls enclosing them. Varos leaned forward. "You would have me wage war, Sarion? Against whom?" Sarion's lips curled slightly. "Against the weak." A silence followed. Varos let it linger, measuring the room, the knights, the pulse of something unseen moving beneath the surface of this gathering. Finally he exhaled, tapping a single armored finger against the map. "Then we will hunt. Gather the riders. We move at dawn." A murmur of approval stirred through the gathered knights, but in Sarion's golden eyes there was no satisfaction, only expectation. Later that night, the betrayal begins. The halls of Drakenhold were never truly quiet. Torches burned low, casting flickering shadows over the walls, and the distant howls of wolves echoed beyond the battlements. The castle's undead servants moved in silence, their glassy eyes void of anything resembling thought. Varos stood alone on the fortress's highest balcony, overlooking the sprawling darkness of the border princes. He was old enough to sense when something was wrong. Something unnatural coiled through the air tonight. A whisper of movement behind him. He turned, too late. Pain exploded in his side as cold steel drove through his armor, biting deep into his ribs. Varos let out a snarl, pivoting, only to be met by Sarian's face mere inches from his own. "I told you they were restless," Sarian whispered, driving the blade deeper. Varos swung an armored fist into Sarian's face, sending him crashing against the stone railing. His vision blurred as another blade struck, this time into his back. He staggered forward, his lifeblood leaking onto the balcony floor. The shadows behind Sarian moved. More knights stepped forward, their blades slick with fresh treachery. Varos snarled, baring his fangs. "You dare? You have grown weak, old master," Sarian hissed, wiping the blood from his mouth. "The old ways die with you." The other knights moved in. Varos ripped the blade from his ribs. Blood sprang across the stone. His wounds were grievous, but he was no mere mortal. He lashed out, his claws raking across one of the traitors, tearing out the knight's throat in a spray of arterial black. Another knight struck. Varos caught the blade with his bare hand, wrenching it free before shoving it through the traitor's skull. But there were too many. Sarian came again, this time with a two-handed swing meant to take Varos' head from his shoulders. Varos barely managed to twist aside, but the blade still bit deep into his shoulder, cutting through armor and flesh. His left arm went numb. A final savage kick from Sarian sent Varos sprawling back against the balcony ledge. He struggled to rise, but his legs refused him. Sarian stood over him now, sword raised, golden eyes glimmering with triumph. "Drakenhold is mine now," Sarian whispered. He swung. The blade came down, and Varos was gone. Plunging from the balcony's edge, he vanished into the abyss below. The war begins. The fortress of Drakenhold erupted in chaos. Loyalists fought traitors, blood painted the walls, and the once unified blood dragons were torn asunder. Far below, Varos crawled from the wreckage, his body broken but not beaten. He would return, and he would paint Drakenhall with Sarian's blood. Chapter 2. A Blade in the Dark. The Feast of Betrayal. The great hall of Drakenhold was filled with the scent of blood. Torches burned low, their eerie blue witchlight casting long, writhing shadows along the stone walls. The towering Gothic arches above seemed like the ribcage of some long-dead leviathan, a fitting tomb for the mortal lives being drained below. A banquet of crimson excess was laid out before the assembled blood dragons. Human captives hung from iron chains, their throats slit, their bodies suspended above silver goblets that caught the lifeblood as it dripped. The knights toasted in silence, their pale fingers wrapped around goblets filled with fresh, still warm vitae. The scent of it was intoxicating, pure, untainted blood from warriors and nobles, taken in battle as trophies. At the head of the table, Lord Varos the Crimson Fang sat in his throne of black iron, his crimson plate gleaming under the torchlight. A disciple of Abhorash, he drank not for pleasure, but for necessity, his restraint the mark of a warrior. His golden eyes swept across the gathered knights, gauging them, searching for the ever-present cracks in their discipline. Beside him, Sarion von Valgeist, his second in command, raised his own goblet. His golden eyes shimmered with amusement, a predator toying with its prey. "To our Lord Varos the Crimson Fang," Sarion declared, his voice smooth as silk. "May his rule over Drakenhold be eternal." A murmur of assent followed. The assembled knights raised their goblets. The room drank. Varos lowered his cup without touching it to his lips. Something was wrong. The scent of blood in the air was too rich, too heady, laced with something unnatural. A trick. A poison, not one that could kill a vampire, but one that could weaken. He shifted in his throne, his muscles tensing. The knights were watching him too closely. Something flickered in their gazes. Anticipation. And then, The first blade came. The first strike. The knight lunged from Varos's left, his blade flashing in the torchlight, aimed for his throat. But Varos was no fledgling. With a snarl, he twisted from his throne, the assassin's blade skimming past his jugular, carving deep into the iron seat instead. Stone shattered, splintering as the force of the impact shook the hall. The banquet erupted into chaos. More knights moved. Swords scraped from scabbards, chairs overturned, goblets clattered to the floor, and in the span of a breath, the grand feast of the blood dragons became a slaughterhouse. Varos drove his armored fist into his attacker's chest, shattering ribs and sending the knight crashing across the banquet table. Goblets spilled, blood sloshing across the stone like spilt wine. He whirled, already grasping for his greatsword, but another knight struck, a dagger ramming deep into his side. Varus let out a snarl of pain. More blades came. One from behind, he twisted, catching the steel with his gauntlet. The metal screeched as he crushed the blade between his fingers, ripping it from the assassin's grip before slamming his fist through the traitor's skull. Another knight leapt onto the table, driving both boots into Varos's chest, sending him crashing backward through the throne. The iron crumpled beneath him, sharp edges tearing into his flesh. For the first time in centuries, Varos tasted his own blood. Treachery. His own knights, his own brothers. Through the blur of pain he heard Sarion's voice, smooth and mocking. "It did not have to be this way, old friend." Varos snarled, shoving himself to his feet. Blood seeped from his wounds, but he did not fall. Sarion stood before him now, blade in hand, surrounded by the knights who had once sworn their loyalty. "Your time is over, Varos," Sarion said, tilting his head. "You have clung to Abhorash's ways for too long. This war-torn land is ripe for the taking, and yet you would have us do nothing. The blood dragons do not stand idle. We rule through strength." Varos spat blood under the stone. "You were always ambitious, Sarion," he rasped, his grip tightening around the hilt of his greatsword. "And you were always blind," Sarion countered. "Your honor, your restraint, it makes you weak." Varos laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Then come, traitor, prove it." The duel of the betrayed. Sarion moved like a shadow, his blade flashing with inhuman speed. Varos met him head-on, their swords clashing in a shower of sparks and steel. The great hall shook as they exchanged blows. Varos' strength was monstrous, his swings capable of cleaving men in two, but Sarion was faster, weaving between attacks, his blade darting like a viper. They fought across the banquet table, over the bodies of slain knights. Varos lunged. Sarion ducked, his sword whipping out in a blinding arc. The edge bit deep into Varos's shoulder, cutting through armor and into bone. Pain flared, but Varos fought on. He drove forward, hammering his gauntleted fist into Sarion's ribs. The traitor staggered back, breath hitching as Varos pressed the assault. He swung his greatsword down, a killing blow. Sarion rolled aside at the last moment, Varos' sword shattering the stone where he had stood. Then another blade struck. One of the traitors drove his sword into Varos's back, the steel bursting through his chest in a spray of dark crimson. Varos staggered, his vision blurring. A second blade bit into his thigh. A third ripped into his side. He fell to one knee, his breath ragged, blood pooling beneath him. Too many. The traitors closed in, their faces blank masks of obedience to their new lord. Sarion stepped forward, his blade raised for the final strike. "Goodbye, old friend." The sword came down. At the last moment, Varos surged forward not to fight, but to flee. With the last of his strength, he hurled himself through the banquet hall's great stained glass window, the ancient glass shattering into 1,000 jagged shards. The night swallowed him whole. His body broken, his fortress lost, his bloodline divided. And as he tumbled into the abyss below, he swore but one thing: he would return. and Drakenhold would drown in its own treachery. Chapter 3. The Fall of Drakenhold. The Night of Ashes. Varos fell through the night like a dying comet. The storm-racked winds howled around him, tearing at his armor, whipping his crimson cloak into the darkness. The shattered glass of the banquet hall's great window followed him, glittering like malevolent stars as they descended into the abyss. Then impact. His body slammed into the jagged rocks below, bones snapping, pain ripping through him like wildfire. He rolled, tumbling down the fortress cliffs, his blood staining the black stone. He came to a halt at the foot of the mountain, half submerged in the icy waters of the moat. For a moment, all was silence. His vision blurred, the world tilting. Above him, the fortress of Drakenhold burned. Flames raged against the storm, crawling up the towering spires, licking hungrily at the battlements. The banners of the blood dragons, his banners, were torn down, replaced with new sigils bearing Sirion's mark. Screams echoed from within. The sounds of slaughter. The dead and dying tumbled from the walls, loyalists hurled into the abyss by Sirion's traitors. Some knights still fought desperately, but it was clear. The battle was already lost. Varos tried to move, his body screaming in protest. He was too wounded to fight, too broken to return. For the first time in centuries, Lord Varos the Crimson Fang was powerless. He clenched his fists in the mud, his vision darkening. Then, from the battlements above, he heard Sirion's voice. The crowning of a traitor. Sirion stood atop the high balcony of Drakenhold, framed by fire and ruin. His black armor, stained with the blood of his former brothers, gleamed in the torchlight. His golden eyes burned with something primal, victory. He raised his sword, Varos's throne visible behind him, drenched in the blood of its former master. "Drakenhold is mine," he declared, his voice cutting through the howling winds. "The rule of Lord Varos is over. He is dead, cast from these walls like the failed tyrant he was." A cheer erupted from the assembled knights. Some chanted Sirion's name, others, those who had been reluctant to betray their former lord, remained silent. Sirion turned his gaze across the crowd, his presence radiating command. "No longer shall we be bound by the weak traditions of the past." He spread his arms, the firelight painting him as a figure of both majesty and horror. "No longer shall we waste our strength on foolish codes of honor. The blood dragons are predators, not guardians. We will rule this land, not lurk in its shadows." More cheers, this time louder, fiercer. Sirion let the moment settle before his voice dropped to a low growl. "Varos refused to lead us as we were meant to be led. He clung to the ways of Abhorash, honor, restraint, a war without conquest." He spat. "That time is over. We are rulers now, and I am your lord." A final, deafening cheer rang through the fortress. Sirion raised his blade once more, and the flames around Drakenhold roared higher, as if the fortress itself acknowledged its new master. Lord Varos was no more. Sirion von Vargeist was now lord of the blood dragons. The escape. Below, in the shadows of the burning castle, Varos stirred. Pain lanced through his shattered ribs as he dragged himself out of the water, each movement an agony that nearly forced him into unconsciousness. But he would not die here. Not like this. Using the last reserves of his unnatural strength, he pulled himself toward the darkness of the forest beyond the cliffs. The howls of wolves echoed through the trees, drawn by the scent of blood. But Varos was no prey. He vanished into the night. Rumors of the dead. The fall of Drakenhold sent ripples through the border princes. Rumors spread like wildfire. Lord Varos is dead. The great blood dragon has fallen. Sirion von Vargeist rules now. A new age for the blood dragons begins. Some whispered Varos had been torn apart. Others claimed he had been struck down in single combat by Sirion himself. Few knew the truth, that their fallen lord still lived. A new vow. Far from Drakenhold, deep in the ruined forests, Varos collapsed onto the cold earth beneath a dead oak. His body was shattered, his strength was failing. But as he lay there, staring up at the blood-red moon, something stirred deep within him. A fire. A rage so deep it burned hotter than his wounds. Sirion had stolen everything. His throne, his knights, his fortress. But Varos was not dead, and so long as he lived, he would have his vengeance. He let out a low growl, a promise to the night, to the gods, to any who would listen. I will return, and I will drown Drakenhold in its own blood. The night swallowed his words, and the hunt for vengeance began. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Borderlands. The hunt begins. The Border Princes were a land of chaos, a battlefield of forgotten kings, a graveyard of warlords who dared to carve their dominions from the carcass of the old world. Lawless mercenary bands prowled the roads, war-torn villages burned under the banners of transient rulers, and worse things that howled in the night, stalked the wilderness. But tonight the hunted were no mere mortals. A shadowed figure darted through the undergrowth, moving with inhuman speed. His armor was cracked and smeared with blood, some of it his own, most of it not. His crimson cloak was in tatters, torn from the claws of battle and the relentless pursuit that followed. His golden eyes, once alight with the cold discipline of a warrior, now burned with a relentless hunger. Varos lived, and Sarion's warbands were hunting him. Behind him, two more figures moved through the shadows, his last remaining loyalists. Dame Isolde the Silent, once a noblewoman of Bretonnia, turned by Varos decades ago, a warrior of cold, calculating brutality. Her obsidian plate was darkened with the blood of Sarion's traitors. Her blade was chipped but unbowed, her movements as silent as the grave she had long abandoned. Lord Draskar the Dread, a towering knight, broader than most of his kin, his fanged grin visible beneath his crimson-edged helm. A brutal duelist, his armor was still slick with the gore of the knights he had personally cut down during the betrayal. Varos stopped, crouching low behind a fallen tree, his keen senses scanning the murky darkness ahead. The borderlands stretched before them, a place where twisted forests and jagged mountains swallowed entire armies. A land fit for monsters and outlaws. "We cannot stop," Isolde whispered, her voice barely audible. "They are close." Varos closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Then he heard it, the sound of hooves pounding against wet earth. They were not alone. The hunted. From the ridge above, torchlight flickered. Sirion's warband. They rode in blackened steel, their horses draped in tattered barding, their swords still wet with the blood of those who resisted Sirion's claim. They were blood knights, hunters of the night, and their loyalty now belonged to the usurper of Drakenhold. One of them, a monstrous figure with a scarred helm, reined in his steed. He sniffed the air. "He's close," the knight growled. "I smell his blood." The leader of the warband, Lord Kale, one of Sirion's chosen enforcers, smiled cruelly. "Then we run them down." With a swift motion, he raised his gauntleted hand and the warband surged forward, hooves thundering down the hillside. Varos and his knights ran. They tore through the underbrush, dodging gnarled roots and jagged rocks, moving with the inhuman speed of their kind. Behind them the howls of dire wolves echoed in the night, Sirion's beasts, bred for the hunt, loosed upon them like starving hounds. "Faster," Draskar growled, his heavy armor slowing him slightly. Ahead, through the twisting fog, something loomed in the distance. A fortress, long abandoned. Its broken towers reached toward the sky like the skeletal remains of some forgotten beast, its crumbling battlements barely standing against the weight of centuries. "Blackspire Keep," Isolde breathed. A ruin, lost to time, a place of legends and curses, a perfect refuge for the damned. "Inside now," Varos commanded. The three rushed toward the shattered gates, the howls of the hunters closing in behind them. The gates of Blackspire. They crossed the threshold just as the first of Sarian's wolves leapt, its slavering jaws snapping inches from Draskar's throat. Draskar caught the beast in mid-air, his armored gauntlet locking around its skull before he wrenched its head clean off, the spine tearing free with a wet crack. The war band was almost upon them. Varos turned, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his greatsword. If they had to die here, they would make it a grave worthy of legend. But then, a deep, resonant boom. The gates of Blackspire Keep slammed shut behind them. By no visible force. The warband skidded to a halt outside, their steeds screeching in protest. Inside, silence fell. Draskar exhaled, chuckling. "Fortune favors us, it seems. Or curses us," Isolde muttered, her fingers resting uneasily on the hilt of her blade. Varos remained still, his senses stretched outward. The air inside the keep was thick, heavy with the weight of something ancient, something watching them. "We will rest here," Varos said finally. "Regain our strength, then we strike back." Drakenhold may have fallen, but the war was not over, and Blackspire Keep had awakened. Chapter 5. The War Begins. Blood against blood. The war for Drakenhold had begun. Like a fresh wound torn open, the blood dragon bloodline bled into factions, their loyalties shifting like the sands of the border princes. Where once they had stood as an unbreakable brotherhood, bound by the martial code of Abhorash, now they turned upon one another, their swords drawn not against mortals, but against their own kind. With Varos presumed dead, Sarian von Vargeist sat upon the throne of Drakenhold, draped in the spoils of his treachery. But even in victory, he knew his reign was not yet secured. There were those who bent the knee, eager to serve their new master. There were those who despised him, plotting rebellion in the dark. And then there were those who saw opportunity in the bloodshed. Warlords with no loyalty to either side, eager to carve out their own fiefdoms in the chaos. The war had begun, and the first battle would be fought in the shadows. The lords who chose a side. From the ruins of old strongholds, from the crypts of long-dead kings, from fortresses untouched for centuries, the lords of the blood dragons gathered their banners. Some answered Sarian's call. Others prepared to strike him down. The loyalists of Drakenhold, the usurper's army. Sarian's dominion was built on blood and betrayal. Those who pledged fealty to him did so not out of love, but out of ambition or fear. They saw his ascension as an inevitability, his vision of conquest as an opportunity for power. Among his new court, 3 figures stood out. Lord Kael the Black Lance, a cruel knight, known for his hatred of the living, who hunted men like game. He had always questioned Varus's reluctance to wage full-scale war, and Sarian's promise of an empire drenched in blood appealed to his savage nature. Lady Veda of the Crimson Hunt, a monster in human form who rode with a pack of cursed dire wolves, her fangs permanently stained red from the flesh of her victims. She had been denied a place in Varos' court, seen as too feral, too undisciplined. Now she would feast on his legacy. Dreadlord Gavran the Hollow, a master duelist, once Varos' chief executioner, now Sarian's blade for hire. He fought not out of loyalty, but because he wished to slay every last knight who had once called Varos lord. These were Sarian's champions. With them he prepared to enforce his rule. The rebels, those who denied the usurper. Not all blood dragons bent the knee to Sarian. In the dark halls of forgotten castles, in the wilderness where the cursed knights had first learned their craft, the rebellion festered. Some still believed in Varos, Some simply refused to acknowledge Sarian's rule. Among them, Duke Alaric the Pale, a reclusive Night Lord, his armor white as bone, who had always disapproved of Sarian's ambitions. He had no love for Varos, but he detested traitors even more. The Crimson Zealots, a brotherhood of knights who still revered Abhorash, believing that Sarian's reign was a perversion of the blood dragon legacy. Gregor the Hollow, a necromancer, exiled by Varos himself, who now saw opportunity in aiding his former master's enemies. Their forces were scattered, but they were determined, and they had not forgotten the true ruler of Drakenhold. The opportunists, lords of the wastes. Not all blood dragons cared for the civil war. For some, it was a game of survival. For others, a chance to take what had long been denied. Among the most dangerous of these rogue warlords was Baron Valdrek the Butcher, a towering monstrosity of a knight known for slaughtering entire villages to bathe in their blood. He cared not for Sarian or Varos. He wanted only war, death, and the power it would bring. Lady Sikaris the Veiled, a former Lamian who had taken the blood dragon curse, known for her deception and cruelty. She had no desire to follow Sarian's orders, nor did she care for Varos' outdated ways. Instead, she planned to pit both sides against each other, feeding on the chaos. The Black Grail Knights, once noble knights of Bretonnia, now cursed revenants, who swore loyalty only to the strongest warrior among them. Whoever proved their dominance in this war, they would follow. Until then, they fought only for their own glory. The wilderness of the border princes burned with the fires of ambition. The blood dragons were no longer one bloodline. They were splintered, fractured, broken. And soon, only the strongest would remain. The first battle of the blood dragons. The first clash came beneath the ruined walls of Castle Varnoff. A fortress long abandoned, its crumbling towers watched over a field now soaked in red. Sarian's forces came to claim it and found rebels waiting. The storm raged overhead, lightning crackling through the sky as two armies of the undead met in battle. "No more words," snarled Lord Kale as he spurred his warhorse forward. "No more waiting. Kill them all." The rebels answered in kind. Swords clashed, fangs sank into flesh, and blood dragons who had once fought side by side now tore each other apart like rabid beasts. The ground was slick with blackened viti. Warriors howled in pain as steel bit into their undead bodies. The war had begun, and only one ruler would stand in the end. In the shadows, the return of the true lord. Far from the battlefield, hidden in the ruins of Blackspire Keep, Varos watched. The war had begun without him. His bloodline tore itself apart in his absence. And yet, he felt no sorrow, only cold, calculating hunger. "Let them fight," he murmured, his wounds healing, his strength returning. "Let them weaken each other." He turned to Isolde and Draskar, his remaining knights, his voice a whisper of steel. "We are not yet strong enough to strike, but we will be. We will watch, we will hunt, and when they are at their weakest, we will take back what is ours." The night stretched before him, filled with the sounds of battle, the scent of blood, and the promise of vengeance. The war for Drakenhold had begun, and Varos was coming. Chapter 6. The Oath of the Exiled. The gathering storm. The ruined halls of Blackspire Keep were silent, save for the howling wind that swept through the shattered corridors. Dust and decay clung to the ancient stones, and the shadows seemed alive, shifting and breathing with unseen forces. At the heart of the keep, Lord Varos the Crimson Fang stood before a cracked stone altar, his crimson armor tarnished with dried blood. His body still bore the wounds of Sarian's betrayal, but his golden eyes burned with unrelenting purpose. Tonight he would swear an oath, a promise written in blood and vengeance. Before him a shallow iron bowl rested upon the altar. In its center a pool of dark vitae shimmered under the pale torchlight, thick as oil, heavy with power. Varos raised his dagger, a wicked blade forged from the fang of an ancient dragon, its edge honed sharper than mortal steel. Without hesitation, he drew it across his palm, his undead flesh parting without pain. Dark blood dripped into the waiting bowl. He closed his fist, letting the vitae pool, then pressed his bloodied palm against the altar, sealing his oath to the dark gods who listened in the void. By this blood I swear vengeance. By my blade I reclaim what was stolen. By my will Drakenhold shall burn, and the traitors shall drown in their own treachery. The air trembled, a whisper of ancient power stirring in the bones of the ruined fortress. Varos exhaled slowly. The oath was spoken. Now he needed an army to enforce it, and he knew where to begin. The exiled lords. The border princes were a graveyard of forgotten warlords, a land where exiled warriors, banished nobles, and disgraced vampires gathered in shadow, waiting for a moment of opportunity. Varos would give them one. For weeks, he and his remaining loyalists, Isolde the Silent and Lord Droska the Dread, hunted through the broken land, seeking those who had been cast aside, those with a thirst for blood and revenge. They found knights who had defied Sarian, warriors who had refused to bend the knee, mercenaries who fought for nothing but coin and carnage. Varric the Unbowed, a former blood dragon lord, stripped of his title for refusing to abandon the old ways. He had once been one of the greatest duelists in the border princes, and his hatred for Sarian burned as fiercely as Varos's own. The Ironclads, a band of rogue vampire knights, exiled for their insatiable bloodlust, clad in heavy armor scarred from centuries of battle. Their leader, Dame Selene the Butcher, had been a terror on the battlefield before Sarian cast her out. The Forsaken Blades, mortal warlords, cursed to serve the vampires they once hunted, led by a former imperial general who had fallen to undeath but never lost his taste for war. Each of them had lost something to Sarian's rise, and each of them wanted it back. Varos gave them purpose. Sirion sits on a stolen throne. His rule is false. He has betrayed everything we were meant to be. We will not beg for our place in this world. We will take it. Through steel and blood we reclaim our honor. Through slaughter and war we take back what is ours. Follow me, and I will see us restored. The exiles listened. They gathered their swords, and they swore to fight. The army of the exiled blood dragons had been born. But Varos still needed one more ally. Gregor the Hollow, the necromancer's pact. The dead city of Vashnok was older than any kingdom in the border princes. Once a bastion of necromantic power, it had fallen into ruin centuries ago, its streets littered with bones, its crypts home only to whispers and ghosts. But Gregor the Hollow still lived. A necromancer of great renown, disgraced and exiled for his heresies, Gregor had once served Varos as an advisor before the Blood Dragon Lord had cast him out, unwilling to use the dark magics Gregor craved. Now Varos needed him. Through the ruined streets Varos walked, his loyal knights at his side. The air was thick with decay, the shadows shifting unnaturally as specters of the dead moved between the broken buildings. At the heart of the city, a great mausoleum loomed, its doors open like the gaping maw of some slumbering beast. Varos entered. Inside, candles flickered upon an altar of skulls, and a figure stood among the dead. Gregor, once a man of the Empire, now twisted by centuries of undeath. His form was gaunt, his flesh stretched tight over brittle bone. His robes, once the deep crimson of the Amethyst Order, were now ragged and blackened with the stains of 100 vile rituals. His eyes, sunken and dark, flickered with unnatural light. He did not turn as Varos approached. "You of all creatures come to me. Gregor's voice was like dry leaves caught in the wind, a whisper of something long dead. "You have heard what has happened," Varos said. Gregor's lips curled into something resembling a grin. "Oh, the border princes have heard. The great Lord Varos cast down, his throne stolen, his own kin hunting him like a dog." He turned at last, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "And now you come crawling back to the one you cast out. Tell me, Crimson Fang, why should I aid you?" Varos took a step forward. "Because when I reclaim Drakenhold, you will stand beside me. I will grant you dominion over the dead, over the crypts of Sylvania itself, if that is what you wish. But first, Sarion dies." Gregor's chuckle was hollow, and then, slowly, he raised one skeletal hand. From the shadows, the dead began to rise. Their bones clattered, their hollow eyes burning with unholy fire. A host of wights and revenants, bound to Gregor's will. "If it is war you seek," Gregor whispered, "then war you shall have." Varos nodded once. The pact was sealed. The exiled blood dragons had their knights, their warlords, and now their necromancer. The war for Drakenhold had begun in earnest. Varos was no longer alone, and Sarion's reign would soon drown in blood. Chapter 7. The Challenge of Draskar. A duel in the dark. The night was thick with mist, curling through the ruins of Blackspire Keep like ghostly tendrils. The fortress, long abandoned and broken by time, now echoed with the sounds of gathering warbands. The exiled had answered Varos' call. Vampire knights, cast out from their bloodlines, warlords with nothing left but their steel and their thirst for vengeance, and mortal mercenaries who feared neither the living nor the dead. They came to pledge themselves to the war, but their loyalty was not yet certain. Not all among them accepted Varos as their leader, and one stood above the rest in defiance. Lord Draskar the Dread, a towering beast of a vampire, clad in obsidian black plate, his shoulders broad enough to break lesser warriors with a single blow. His helm, shaped like the skull of a dragon, cast his face in shadow, but his eyes burned red like smoldering embers. Once Draskar had been a knight under Varos's command. Once he had fought beside him on fields littered with corpses, his greatsword carving through mortal armies like a scythe through wheat, but Draskar had never bowed easily. And now he would not kneel at all. He stood in the ruined courtyard, his voice a growl of iron and death. "You seek to reclaim your throne, Varos. You seek to lead us to war." "Yes," Varos said, his voice calm, cold. "Then you must prove yourself," Draskar snarled. "Drakenhold fell because you were weak. You let Sarion betray you. You let your knights turn against you. A true lord does not let his kingdom be stolen. A true lord does not fall." He stepped forward, his massive sword grating against the stone as he dragged it along the ground. "If you wish to lead, you must prove you are still worthy." The gathered knights and warlords stirred at his words. The mortals watched in silence, their hands resting on their weapons, waiting. Vampires did not follow words, they followed strength. Draskar raised his greatsword, pointing it at Varos. "I challenge you. Single combat. If you cannot defeat me, you are unfit to reclaim Drakenhold." A hush fell over the crowd. Then Varos stepped forward. Without hesitation, he unsheathed his greatsword, the ancient weapon gleaming in the moonlight, its edge whispering with the promise of death. "I accept." A low murmur rippled through the gathered exiles. This was no simple duel. This was a battle for leadership, a battle for dominion, and only one of them would walk away. The duel begins. The warbands formed a circle, torches flickering as the mist curled around them. Varos and Draskar stood facing one another, their blades reflecting the cold light of the night. The wind was still, the world waiting. Then Draskar moved. Like a black storm he charged, his massive form moving with impossible speed for something so heavy. His great sword swung in a brutal arc, aiming to cleave Varos in two. Varos ducked, the air screaming as the blade passed inches from his head, shattering a section of stone behind him. The ground trembled from the force. Varos countered instantly, his sword slashing toward Draskar's exposed ribs. But Draskar was fast, too fast. He spun, his blade whipping toward Varos's legs, forcing him to leap back. The two warriors circled each other, their golden eyes locked, searching for weakness. "You still move well," Draskar growled, "but you do not fight as you once did." Varos smirked. "I fight to win. Do you?" Draskar roared and charged again, swinging with unrelenting force. Varos parried. Barely, the impact sending a shockwave up his arm. He had forgotten how powerful Draskar was. This was not a duel of skill alone. This was a contest of sheer might. Draskar swung again and again, each strike tearing through the mist, splitting the air like thunder. Varos dodged, countered, struck back, his sword flashing in precise, calculated movements. But Draskar did not slow. A heavy boot struck Varos in the chest, sending him crashing backward into the stone. Before he could rise, Draskar was upon him, blade descending. Varos rolled, the steel crashing into the ground where he had been a moment before, sending a spray of shattered rock into the air. For the first time he felt the weight of this fight pressing upon him. Draskar was unrelenting, but Varos was patient. The killing blow. Varos feinted left, Draskar swung wide, overextending. It was the opening he needed. Varos twisted, bringing his blade upward in a savage, precise arc. Steel met flesh. A spray of black blood burst into the air as Varos' greatsword carved deep into Draskar's side, splitting through his armor, tearing through the flesh beneath. Draskar staggered, his sword dropping for the briefest of moments. Varos did not hesitate. He moved like a shadow, his fangs bared in a snarl as he drove his blade into Draskar's throat. For a moment the battlefield was silent. Then Varos twisted the sword. Draskar let out a choked growl, sinking to one knee, his massive hands clutching at the blade lodged in his throat. The gathered warriors watched in stunned silence. Varos wrenched the blade free, letting Draskar collapse onto the cold stone. The massive warrior coughed, dark blood pooling beneath him. Varos stood over him, his blade dripping with his rival's lifeblood. "Do you yield?" Draskar looked up, his crimson eyes burning with both rage and something else. Respect. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. "I yield." Varos stepped back, allowing Draskar to kneel before him. And then, before the gathered exiles, before the warriors who would follow them into war, Draskar bowed his head. "You are still worthy," he muttered. "Then swear it," Varos said, voice low and firm. Draskar clenched his bloody fists. Then, in front of all, he spoke the words. "I swear my sword to you, Varos, until Sirion is dead, until Drakenhold is ours again, until vengeance is fulfilled." The warbands roared in approval, their fists pounding against armor, their voices rising into the night. Varos had proven himself, and now his army was whole. The war for Drakenhold had truly begun. Chapter 8. The Siege of Redstone. A Throne of Ashes. The fortress of Redstone stood defiant against the storm. Its ancient walls, hewn from the crimson rock of the border princes, gleamed under the pale light of Morsley, the cursed moon casting its eerie glow over the battlefield. The banners of Lord Alaric the Pale, one of the last true blood dragons to oppose Sirion's rule, still flew high, tattered but unbowed. Inside, Alaric's warriors readied themselves for slaughter. No mortal soldiers walked these halls, only vampires, each of them clad in blackened plate, their blades sharpened for war, their fangs wet with fresh blood taken from the last mortal army that dared to challenge them. Tonight, however, their enemy was not human. It was their own kind, the usurper's march. The ground trembled as Sarion's war host arrived. Hundreds of undead knights, mounted upon massive war horses clad in jagged barding, rode in formation, their black banners whipping in the wind. The traitors of Drakenhold, those who had pledged themselves to Sirion, now stood ready to tear down the last remnants of the old blood dragon order. At their head, Sarion von Volgeist, the usurper, the betrayer, the false lord of Drakenhold, sat upon his black steed, his armor glistening in the torchlight. His golden eyes burned with cold amusement, his lips curled into a faint smile. "Break the gates," he commanded, his voice carrying over the howling winds. His necromancers stepped forward, their robes billowing, their hands twisting in unnatural gestures. The ground cracked and split, and from the earth twisted shapes crawled forth. Undead abominations, creatures of fused bone and rotting flesh, their mouths stitched together by dark magic, their empty sockets burning with unholy light. Behind them, siege towers, built from the bones of fallen warriors, groaned as they were pushed forward. Burn them out. The first flaming projectiles were launched. Massive boulders, drenched in pitch and set alight, crashed against the walls, sending splintered stone and molten rock cascading into the defenders below. The siege had begun. Inside the fortress, Lord Alaric the Pale stood upon the battlements, his white armor stained with the blood of past wars, his long greatsword resting across his back. His vampiric eyes surveyed the field below, his expression unreadable. Behind him his knights stood ready, their crimson cloaks fluttering in the wind. "Sarion comes," one of his warriors growled. "Let him," Alaric said coldly. "He will not take redstone so easily." A deafening crack split the air. One of the gate towers collapsed under Sarion's bombardment. The traitors' forces surged forward, undead knights charging toward the breach, their weapons glinting like fangs in the firelight. Alaric drew his sword, its silvered edge glimmering. "Kill them all." The blood dragon reborn. The first battle erupted in the shattered gateway, where Sarion's knights met Alaric's warriors in brutal, bloody combat. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and fangs tore through steel and flesh alike. The roar of battle filled the night, a chorus of screams, snarls, and the wet crunch of bone meeting steel. Sirion watched from atop his steed, his expression unreadable. Then, something changed. A new sound filled the air. Not the clash of battle, but something else. The distant howling of wolves. The thunder of hooves. The war cry of warriors who had no right to still be alive. A dark shadow moved across the battlefield, swift and precise, a phantom force that tore into Sarion's siege lines like a blade through rotten flesh. "What?" Sarion hissed, his golden eyes narrowing. "What is this?" Then, through the smoke and blood, he saw him. Varos, the Crimson Fang. The ambush. Varos rode at the head of his army, his crimson armor gleaming, his greatsword dripping with the lifeblood of the first traitor he had slain that night. Behind him, Draskar the Dread, Damizold the Silent, and the warriors of the exiled blood dragons followed, cutting into Sarion's forces with the fury of the damned. Draskar waded into the enemy ranks, his massive blade carving through flesh and steel alike, his laughter echoing through the screams of the dying. Isolde moved like a ghost, her twin daggers finding gaps in armor, each strike precise, each kill a work of art. Gregor the Hollow's necromantic horrors surged forward, ripping through Sarion's necromancers, turning their own undead abominations against them. The siege lines burned. Sarion's war host fractured, and for the first time since the treachery at Drakenhold, Sarion felt something he had not expected to feel. Doubt. The duel in the fire. Sarian dismounted, his blade already in hand. Varos strode toward him, stepping over corpses still twitching in the mud. For a moment the battle raged around them, but the two warriors only saw each other. The usurper, their rightful lord. Sarian smiled. I should have torn out your heart when I had the chance. Varos raised his sword, his fangs bared. You never had the chance. And then they clashed. The force of their strikes sent shockwaves through the battlefield, their blades ringing in the night. Sarian struck fast, precise, seeking weaknesses in Varos's guard. Varos fought with brutal, unrelenting power, forcing Sarian back inch by inch. The fires of war burned around them, illuminating their duel in hellish light. Sarian lashed out, his blade carving a deep gash across Varos' shoulder. Varos ignored the pain, driving his own sword forward, the tip slicing across Sarian's face, drawing the first real blood from the usurper. They fought like gods of old, their strength beyond mortal comprehension, each strike shaking the very ground beneath them. Then a horn sounded. The remaining forces of redstone surged forward, emboldened by Varos' return. Sarian's warhost buckled. The usurper snarled, stepping back. His forces were losing. If he stayed, he would die. This is not over, Sarian spat. Drakenhold is mine, Varos, you will not take it from me. He turned and vanished into the smoke, his surviving knights retreating into the darkness. Varos did not pursue. Instead, he stood victorious on the burning fields of redstone. His exile was over. The war had truly begun. Chapter 9. The Ghost of Abhorash. A Vision in Blood. The battlefield was still smoldering. The ruins of Redstone Keep stood broken, its walls shattered, its banners burned to ash. The siege had ended in carnage, Sarian's forces driven back into the darkness, leaving behind only the dead and the dying. Varos stood among the corpses, his crimson armor blackened with soot and streaked with gore. His greatsword was slick with vitae, the blood of traitors still steaming in the cold night air. The air was thick with the scent of death. And yet he felt no triumph. His knights gathered around him, Draskar the Dread, his blood-stained gauntlets gripping his massive blade, Isolde the Silent, her expression unreadable as she wiped gore from her daggers, and Gregor the Hollow, his necromantic horrors still feasting upon the corpses of Sarian's dead. Victory had been theirs. But the war was far from over. The fires still burned. Varos exhaled, stepping away from the carnage, his boots crunching over the skulls of the fallen. His warriors did not follow. They knew when their lord wished to be alone. He walked into the ruins, into the cold silence of Redstone's great hall. Its once proud architecture now a graveyard of shattered stone and broken sigils. His wounds still burned. His mind was restless. He had won. But at what cost? He had always been a warrior, a disciple of Abhorash, sworn to a higher purpose than mere conquest. And yet, as the war raged on, as he cut down those who had once sworn loyalty, he could no longer deny the truth clawing at his soul. Was he fighting for the blood dragons? Or was he simply fighting for vengeance? The voice in the darkness. A gust of wind swept through the ruined hall. The torches flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness. Then a voice. Low, powerful, ageless. You have forgotten. Varos froze, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his blade. The shadows shifted, and from them a figure emerged. A warrior, clad in ancient armor, his crimson cloak flowing as if caught in an unseen wind. His face was hidden beneath a black helm, but his eyes burned like twin embers, filled with an unnatural, piercing light. Varos knew that armor. He knew that presence. His throat tightened. No. The figure stepped closer, his form wreathed in shadows that pulsed with unseen power. You have lost your way, Varos. You stain the name of our bloodline with your anger. Varos set his jaw, gripping his sword hilt. Who are you? The figure's burning eyes locked onto his own. You already know. Varos staggered back, the weight of recognition slamming into him like a hammer. Abhorash, the first, the father of the blood dragons. His master, his lord. The trial of the Blood Knight. This war is not about you. The words struck like a blade to the chest. Varos snarled, his golden eyes flashing. Sarion betrayed me. He stole my throne. He dishonored everything we are. The figure did not move. And you would reclaim your throne through what? A war of vengeance, an endless slaughter of your own kin? Varos growled, his gauntlets clenching. They are traitors. They abandoned the ways of our order. And have you remained faithful to them? Varos froze. The figure stepped closer, his voice low, unrelenting. Do you remember why we exist? Do you remember what you swore on the night I turned you? Varos's breath hitched. The memories came flooding back. Centuries ago, the night he had been turned. The night Abhorash had made him more than a man, had made him something greater, not a monster, not a tyrant, a warrior, a knight, one who would seek strength not for himself, but to overcome the curse of their kind, one who would never drink from the weak, one who would pursue the path of the warrior until the end of time. His oath, had he truly forgotten it? The weight of a promise. Varos felt his rage waver. The war had consumed him. Sarion had robbed him of his throne, his legacy, his honor. But had he truly become any different from his enemy? Abhorash's burning gaze bore into him. Do you fight for the blood dragons, Varos? Or do you fight for yourself? Varos lowered his head. For the first time in centuries, he felt doubt. And then the figure was gone. The torches flared back to life. The hall was empty. But the voice lingered in his mind, whispering through the darkness. Remember your oath. A new purpose. Varos emerged from the ruins, a changed man. Draskar was the first to approach. What is it? The towering knight rumbled. You look different. Varos turned to his army, his golden eyes sharper than before. This war is not just about Sarion. Draskar narrowed his eyes. Then what is it about? Varos exhaled, looking over the warriors who had gathered to fight beside him. Blood dragons, exiles, mercenaries. Each one had a choice, just as he did. And he would not lead them into ruin for personal vengeance. No, this was about something greater. This is about our legacy. Sarion seeks to corrupt what we are, to twist us into nothing more than monsters, feeding on the weak. That is not our way. We do not fight for hunger. We do not fight for conquest. We fight for the perfection of battle itself. We fight to be more than what this curse has made us. He stepped forward, his voice stronger than it had been in years. This war is not for my throne. It is for the soul of our bloodline. The exiled blood dragons stirred, their eyes meeting his. They heard his words. They felt his conviction. And one by one they nodded. Draskar grunted, a rare grin crossing his scarred face. Now that, he growled, is a war worth fighting. Varos looked toward the east, toward Drakenhold. This war was no longer about revenge. It was about preservation. He had sworn a new oath, and he would not fail. Chapter 10. The Waking Horror. The battle that should not have been fought. The moon hung red in the sky, bathing the battlefield in a sickly crimson light. The war for Drakenhold had escalated. The exiled blood dragons, led by Varos and the traitor knights of Sarion, had clashed again. This time their battlefield was the ruins of Vartok, a long-forgotten burial site of ancient vampires. Legends whispered that Vartok was cursed, its crypt sealed for a reason no one dared to remember. Tonight, that forgotten reason would wake. A battle in the graveyard. The ruins of Vartok were little more than a sunken graveyard, a city swallowed by time, dust, and bone. Jagged mausoleums jutted from the earth, their doors sealed by centuries of black magic. Gargantuan stone coffins, carved with runes long faded, lay cracked and half-buried beneath twisted trees, their roots curling around sarcophagi like grasping fingers. The bones of the ancient dead littered the ground, half-sunken in the earth, forgotten by time. This was not a place where mortals should tread. And yet, vampires now fought upon its cursed soil. The clash of the exiled and the betrayers. Steel met steel. Fangs met flesh. The battlefield was an orchestra of slaughter, a cacophony of snarls, screams, and the wet crunch of blades carving through undead flesh. Varos fought at the forefront of the carnage, his greatsword flashing like a storm of blood, cutting down Sarian's knights as they swarmed him. One traitor lunged for his throat. Varos pivoted, his gauntleted fist caving in the knight's skull with a sickening crunch. Another came from behind. Varos spun, severing the knight's arms in one fluid motion before kicking him onto the ground, impaling him through the chest. A third knight tried to strike low. Varos caught his blade with his bare hand, yanked him forward, and drove his fangs deep into his throat, drinking until nothing remained. Nearby, Draskar the Dread roared as he ripped a knight in half with his bare hands, his obsidian-black plate drenched in ichor. Isolde the Silent moved like a ghost in the night, her daggers flashing, cutting through the gaps in armor with precise surgical efficiency. And then the ground trembled. Varos froze mid-swing. The battlefield went still for a single unnatural moment. Then the dead screamed. The crypt is breached. A tremor ripped through the ruins, splitting the earth open like a festering wound. One of the ancient mausoleums crumbled, its stone door splintering outward as if something inside had broken free. A wave of unnatural energy pulsed through the battlefield, cold as the grave, thick with the scent of rotting blood. The warriors, both exiled and traitors, staggered back, their immortal senses recoiling from the sheer wrongness of the power now spilling into the air. Then, from the depths of the shattered crypt, something moved. Something old. Something hungry. The blood fiend awakens. A hand emerged first, clawed and black as midnight, its flesh stretched tight over unnatural bone. Then another. A head followed, its face locked in a permanent twisted rictus of hunger, its eyes like burning coals, sunken deep into a skull too elongated, too monstrous to be fully vampire. And then it rose, a creature of impossible size, standing twice as tall as any knight, its ribcage twisted and elongated, its arms stretched into grotesque talon-like limbs. A blood fiend, a creature of legend, a horror from before even the time of Abhorash, a vampire that had become too lost to the hunger, too consumed by the thirst, until it had transcended into something neither alive nor dead. It had been sealed away for centuries, bound by the long-forgotten blood dragons of old, and now it was free. It screamed, a piercing wail that shattered what little sanity remained among those who heard it. Then it moved. The carnage unleashed. The first knight who dared to attack it was torn apart before he could swing his blade. The blood fiend's clawed hand shot out, ripping the knight's spine from his back, his lifeless corpse crumpling to the ground before he could even scream. A second knight charged, impaling his sword into its chest. It did nothing. The creature swung its arm, tearing the knight in half, his blood painting the ruined stones beneath them. And then it fed. It descended upon the corpses, tearing into them with monstrous ferocity, drinking so deep that their bodies shriveled, their bones snapping as they collapsed into husks. For the first time in centuries, the warriors of the Blood Dragon line knew fear. Even Sarion's knights hesitated, their weapons shaking in their hands. And then, from the battlefield's edge, a single voice cut through the chaos. "Enough. Varos." His greatsword gleamed with fresh blood, his golden eyes burning with fury. He stepped forward, his voice like thunder on the wind. "You are an abomination." The blood fiend turned, its burning eyes locking on to Varos. A flicker of something almost like recognition stirred in its expression. Varos raised his blade. "And I will put you back in your grave." A battle beyond death. The blood fiend lunged, moving with impossible speed for its monstrous size, its claws ripping toward Varos like spears. Varos dodged, rolling beneath its swing, his sword flashing upward, carving a deep gash across the creature's chest. But it did not bleed. The wound sealed almost instantly. Varos's eyes narrowed. It was feeding on the battlefield, on the blood, on the war itself. He could not kill it in the traditional way. He had to bind it. The old ways, the forbidden ways. He called out, "Gregor!" The necromancer lifted his staff, his eyes flaring with dark magic. The earth began to tremble once more. Chains of spectral energy lashed out from the ruins, coiling around the blood fiend's limbs, pulling it back toward the tomb that had once been its prison. The creature screamed, thrashing, but the magic held. Varos lunged forward, driving his blade deep into the creature's throat, pinning it against the crumbling stone. And with one final pulse of magic, Gregor sealed the crypt once more. The blood fiend roared in fury, and then it was gone. The battlefield was silent. Then Sarion's forces began to retreat. The war had changed. Something darker had awakened. And Varos knew this was no longer just about a throne. Something old was stirring in the bloodline, and the war had only just begun. Chapter 11. The Pact of the Damned. The Blood Fiend's Curse. The battle for Vjartok had ended, but the war was no longer the same. The presence of the Blood Fiend, the monstrous thing that had been sealed in the crypt for centuries, had changed everything. Both Varos and Sarion had witnessed its hunger, its power, and for the first time, both sides understood. This was no longer just a war for Drakenhold. Something far worse had begun to stir in the shadows of their bloodline. The aftermath of horror. The ruins of Vjartok were silent now, save for the crackle of dying fires and the occasional groan of the wounded. The dead lay in twisted heaps, bodies drained to the last drop of blood, their faces frozen in eternal agony. Varos stood amidst the carnage, his golden eyes burning in the gloom. His armor was slick with viti, his greatsword resting against his shoulder, its steel stained with the blood of both traitor and beast alike. His army, the exiled knights of Drakenhold, stood behind him, watching as Gregor the Hollow knelt beside the sealed crypt, his bony fingers tracing the ancient runes carved into the stone. "This should not have been disturbed," Gregor murmured, his voice dry and rasping. "We did not open it," Varos replied, his expression unreadable. Something inside wanted to be free. Gregor looked up at him, his blackened lips curling into a knowing grin. "Then it means the seal is weakening." Varos' eyes narrowed. "What seal?" Gregor gestured to the ancient sarcophagus, his fingers drifting across the weathered sigils carved into its surface. This was not just a tomb. This was a prison. This creature, this blood fiend, was bound here, its hunger suppressed, its mind sealed away, but it was never meant to be released. Varus's grip tightened on his sword hilt. Who sealed it? Gregor's sunken eyes gleamed in the firelight. The first blood dragons. Silence fell. Varos felt something cold crawl down his spine. If Gregor spoke the truth, then this was not just some rogue horror of the undead. This thing had been locked away by his own forebears, by Abhorash's own kin, and that meant one terrible thing. If the blood fiend had broken free, then there were more. Cirian's discovery. Far from Vartok, in the ruined depths of Drakenhold, Cirian paced through the shattered halls of his stolen keep. The fortress still bore the scars of war. Its once pristine black stone cracked and scorched from the many battles that had been fought to claim it. But now Cirian had no time to enjoy his victory, because he had seen it too. The blood fiend, the thing that should not have existed, the thing that had nearly turned the tide of war against him, and he would not allow such power to remain beyond his control. The forbidden chamber. Cirian descended into the depths of Drakenhold, where even the oldest of his knights dared not go. Beneath the keep, buried beneath centuries of stone, lay a place that had remained untouched since the time of the first blood dragons. The forbidden chamber. The air grew thick with the scent of dust and decay as Cirian stepped through the heavy, rusted gate. The torches lining the walls flickered, their flames barely able to hold against the oppressive darkness. At the heart of the chamber, a massive stone tablet rested upon an altar, its surface covered in runes older than the Empire itself. Cirian approached, his golden eyes scanning the inscriptions, his fingers brushing across the ancient words. The markings were faded but still legible, and as he read, his expression darkened. A darker truth. The inscriptions told of a curse, a forgotten war waged long before the blood dragons had become what they were today. Long before Abhorash had conquered his hunger, long before the blood knights had taken their oaths of strength. The blood fiends were once blood dragons themselves. They had been warriors, lords, and champions of the vampire order, but something had happened, something had twisted them. They had succumbed to the hunger, abandoning honor and discipline, becoming something else, something unstoppable. The first blood dragons had fought them, hunted them, and sealed them away. Not killed, sealed, because they could not be destroyed. Cirian's lips curled into a snarl. Then we must find more. The power of the blood fiend was beyond anything he had ever seen. If he could harness it, if he could control it, then he would not only crush Varos' rebellion. He would become more than a vampire lord. He would become a god of war. A fateful decision. Back at Vartok, Varos stood before the sealed crypt, his thoughts heavy with the weight of what he had learned. This war was not just a war for a throne. This was a war for the very soul of their bloodline. The blood fiend's escape was not an accident. Something was waking them up. Something was breaking the ancient seals. Varos turned to his army, to his exiled knights, to his mortal mercenaries, to the dark mages who whispered secrets from the shadows. They watched him, waiting. He spoke, his voice cold as the grave. "We must find the rest." Draskar frowned, his massive arms crossed. "You mean to hunt them?" Varos nodded. "If the seals are failing, we must know why. We must find where the other blood fiends sleep, and we must destroy them before Cirian learns to control them." Gregor the Hollow let out a dry chuckle. "If that is even possible." Varos turned, his golden eyes blazing. "Then we will find out." A new war had begun, not just for Drakenhold, not just for vengeance. This war was for the fate of all blood dragons, and Varos would see it through to the end, even if it meant walking into the depths of hell itself. Chapter 12. The March of the Dead. The Gathering Storm. The Border Princes had long been a land of bloodshed, treachery, and war, but never before had the dead themselves marched as an army of their own will. Now they came as a tide of rotting flesh and black steel, an unrelenting force that neither Varos nor Cirian had anticipated. At their head, upon a towering skeletal steed, rode a figure shrouded in midnight black armor, wreathed in mist, his face hidden beneath a war helm carved in the likeness of a fanged dragon. He called himself Vedrek the Eternal, and he proclaimed himself the true heir of Abhorash, a kingdom of the dead. Vedrek's army did not march under the banners of Serian's traitors, nor Varos' exiled knights. They carried no emblems of the blood dragons, only tattered standards, soaked in the blood of the countless villages they had razed. The first to fall had been the warlords of the border princes, mortal kings who had thought themselves safe behind their fortresses, their walls thick and their soldiers many. Now their castles stood empty, their bodies raised from their crypts to serve as new foot soldiers in Vedrek's growing legion. The undead did not stop. They did not rest. They did not retreat. They spread like a plague, and with each battle their numbers only grew. By the time the exiled blood dragons of Varos' host heard whispers of this army, entire regions had already been consumed. And Vedrek's gaze turned toward Drakenhold. The first battle against the Pretender. The first clash came at the ruins of Blackmoor, a once proud fortress now overrun with the dead. Varos and his knights arrived first, drawn by the rumors of an army that did not serve Serian nor any other warlord. What they found was a battlefield of horror. The walls were slick with blood, but no signs of mortal defenders remained. Only undead knights stood upon the parapets, their swords glistening with fresh gore, their lifeless eyes watching the horizon with patient malice. "These are not Serian's forces," Isolde murmured, her daggers gripped tightly. "No," Varos muttered, stepping forward, his golden eyes narrowing. "This is something else." From the shadows of the ruined keep, the enemy revealed itself. Vedrek rode forward, his black armor seemingly absorbing the very light around him, his massive warhorse leaving a trail of frost upon the ground. Behind him, thousands of undead warriors emerged from the fog, their ranks silent, disciplined, unyielding. For a moment, Varos merely watched. Then, Vedrek raised his sword. "Who among you is worthy?" he called, his voice echoing unnaturally across the field. "Who among you still follows the old ways? Who among you dares to call yourselves the sons of Abhorash?" Varos's grip tightened on his greatsword. "Who are you to speak of Abhorash?" he called back. Vedrek's helm tilted slightly, as if amused. "I am the last of his true blood. I am the heir to his will. I am what the blood dragons were meant to become." "Lies!" Varos snarled. "Abhorash left no heir. He sought warriors, not kings. You disgrace his name." Vedrek's laughter was like the scraping of bone upon steel. "Then face me if you doubt my claim." Varos needed no further invitation. The duel of the dead. Varos charged forward, his great sword a blur of silver and crimson as it descended toward Vedrek's skull. But Vedrek did not move. At the last moment, his blade flicked upward, catching Varos' strike in an explosion of sparks. The shock wave of their clash sent cracks splintering through the stones beneath them. "You are strong," Vedrek admitted, his voice like a whisper of the grave. "But you are not strong enough." He countered with terrifying speed, his sword a blur of midnight steel, aiming directly for Varos's throat. Varos barely twisted aside, the blade slicing deep into his shoulder instead, blood spraying across the battlefield. Pain seared through him, but he did not falter. With a snarl, he struck back, his sword cutting through the black plate of Vedrek's armor, drawing dark, thick ichor from the Pretender's side. Vedrek staggered slightly, but did not bleed like a normal vampire. Instead, the wound closed almost instantly, his unnatural regeneration beyond even the greatest of the blood dragons. "You see," Vedrek whispered, "I am beyond you, Varos. You are nothing but an echo of the past." Varos roared, pressing forward, his sword striking faster, harder, seeking any weakness. But Vaedric did not slow. Their blades clashed again and again, the battlefield around them falling into chaos as their forces joined the slaughter. Varos gritted his teeth. Vaedric was not fighting to kill. He was testing him. And then, from the east, another army appeared. Sirion arrives. The traders of Drakenhold rode from the mist, Sirion leading them like a king stepping onto his rightful battlefield. His golden eyes took in the carnage, the clash between Varos and Vaedric. For a moment he merely watched, as if contemplating who to strike first. Then he simply smiled. Kill them both. His knights surged forward, descending upon the battlefield like a tide of death. Varos barely had time to react before he was forced to break from the duel, cutting down one of Sirion's champions who had dared to strike at him. Vaedric turned toward Sirion's approaching knights, his helm tilting once more. Then, without another word, he raised his gauntleted hand, and the dead answered. The battle of three armies. The battlefield erupted into utter carnage. Varos' knights clashed with Sirion's traders, their swords ringing as fangs met steel. But Vaedric's army was something else. The undead warriors did not fight as mindless husks. They fought with skill, with purpose, and as the battle raged, one terrifying fact became clear. Vaedric was not just raising the dead, he was turning their own fallen into his warriors. Every blood dragon that fell beneath his blade rose again. Sirion snarled in fury. Varos felt his blood turn to ice. This was not a warlord. This was something far worse. The true war had begun, and there would be no peace until only one remained. Chapter 13. The Second Betrayal. A throne built on treachery. Drakenhold stood like a blackened corpse upon the mountains, its towers rising against the storm-filled sky, its walls still stained with the blood of its former master's loyalists. Inside, in the great war chamber, Sirion von Vargeist stood over the blood-stained map of the border princes, his golden eyes narrowed, his gauntleted fingers tracing the path of war. The world had spiraled into chaos faster than he had anticipated. Varos was alive, and worse, rallying the exiled blood dragons under his banner. Vaedric had emerged from the grave, commanding an army of the dead, wielding power that should not exist. And now, his own forces were wavering, questioning his rule, whispering doubts like vermin in the dark corners of Drakenhold. Sirion clenched his fist against the table, crushing a silver goblet in his grip. "Lord Karthus," he growled, his voice dripping with impatience. At the far end of the room, a tall, imposing knight stepped forward, his scarred face twisted into something between amusement and contempt. Lord Karthus the Hound, one of Sirion's oldest allies, the first to draw his blade against Varos during the betrayal at Drakenhold. Karthus had been a warlord before he was turned, a bloodthirsty beast in plate armor, a warrior who lived only for slaughter. He had once sworn to follow Sirion into the fires of war, into an age where the blood dragons would rule as true predators. And yet he had done nothing but question Sirion's rule ever since the blood fiend appeared. "You summoned me, my lord," Karthus said, his voice dripping with mock obedience. Sirion's gaze burned into him. "The war does not favor us." Karthus smirked. "No, my lord, it does not favor you." The room fell silent. Sirion felt the air change, felt the weight of something inevitable settling upon him like the first drops of rain before a storm. The moment had come, and Karthus was no longer his ally. The blade in the dark. Sirion did not move, but he could feel the tension in the chamber sharpen to a razor's edge. The knights gathered in the war chamber shifted, some watching in anticipation, others gripping the hilts of their swords, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Sirion exhaled slowly, his voice a whisper of steel. You have made your choice, then? Karthus grinned, stepping forward. I have. You are not fit to rule, Serion. Varos still draws breath because of your failure. Vaedric marches unchallenged because of your hesitation. Your grand war is slipping through your fingers, and I will not let my sword rust under your command. Karthus unsheathed his blade, his blackened steel glinting in the torchlight. Drakenholt is mine now. Serion smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Then take it. In a blur of motion, Serion struck. The fall of Drakenholt begins. The war chamber exploded into violence. Serion moved like a shadow, his blade cutting upward toward Karthus's throat. But Karthus had expected this. He blocked the strike with monstrous strength, the impact shaking the stone beneath them, sending a shockwave through the chamber. Kill them all, Karthus snowed. In an instant, half the knights in the chamber turned on Serion, their swords flashing in the dim light, their oaths to the usurper forgotten. Betrayal begets betrayal. The war within the walls of Drakenholt had begun. The butchery of the traitors. Serion twisted between blades, his sword flashing like a serpent's fang, cutting through the throats and hearts of those who dared raise steel against him. One knight lunged, Serion sidestepped, his blade tearing through the man's chest, his heart exploding in a spray of blood. Another came from behind. Serion turned, driving his elbow into the traitor's skull before ramming his sword through the knight's mouth and out the back of his head. A third tried to strike low. Serion kicked him backward into a brazier, watching as the man screamed while fire devoured his flesh. But Karthus was not idle. He cut through Serion's loyalists like a beast in a feeding frenzy, his sword hacking through plate and bone alike, his roars shaking the very walls. You were never meant to lead, Serion. You were just another warlord playing at being a king. He lunged, his sword a blur of black steel, aiming to carve Serion in half. Serion barely parried, the force of the impact sending him crashing against the war table, splitting it in two. For the first time in centuries, Serion felt pain. And he liked it. Serion laughed, blood trickling from his lips. You think you are better than me? Then prove it. The chaos outside the walls. Even as Drakenholt burned from within, the war outside raged just as fiercely. Karthus's forces descended upon Serion's loyalists, their cloaks of crimson and black now the banners of rebellion. At the same time, Vaedric's undead army drew closer, the sky darkening with the weight of their presence. And in the far distance another army watched. Varos. The exiled blood dragons stood upon the hills beyond the battlefield, watching the betrayal unfold before them. Droskar turned to Varos, his golden eyes gleaming with opportunity. We strike now, we end them both. Varos watched as Serion and Karthus cut into each other, the traitors of Drakenholt, finally devouring their own. He smiled. No. Droskar frowned. Wait. Varos turned away, sheathing his greatsword. Because the more they bleed, the weaker they become. Let them destroy each other. We will kill whoever is left. The war of the blood dragons had become a three-way nightmare, and Varos would be the one who walked away from the carnage. Drakenholt's civil war had reached its boiling point, and soon there would be no throne left to claim. Chapter 14. The Empire Intervenes. The Hammer of Sigmar. For centuries, the Empire of Man had feared the horrors lurking beyond its borders. The ancient vampires, the cursed undead, the lords of the night who drank the blood of men and ruled over lands forsaken by Sigmar. But fear was not enough to stop them. Now, with the civil war of the blood dragons consuming the border princes, a new force was moving into the chaos. A force that would not bargain, would not negotiate, would burn the entire land to the ground if necessary. At the head of this new crusade was witch hunter General Frederick Eisenwald, the greatest vampire hunter in the Empire, a man whose name was whispered with fear among the unliving. And he was coming to exterminate them all. The Empire watches. In Aldadorf, the great capital of the Empire, within the hallowed halls of the Grand Cathedral of Sigmar, a council of witch hunters, priests, and generals had convened. The reports were undeniable. The border princes, already a land of chaos, had become something far worse. The vampires were no longer hiding in their castles, no longer conducting their wars in the shadows. They were waging a full-scale war against each other. Entire villages had been wiped from the map. Towns had fallen silent overnight, their people drained to husks. Fortresses once ruled by mortal lords now stood as charnel houses, filled with the bodies of butchered men. It was worse than ever before. For centuries, the Empire had tolerated the existence of the undead, distracted by wars against orcs, against chaos, against the ever-present internal strife that plagued humanity. But this could not be ignored. The Emperor had given his decree, and it had fallen upon Frederick Eisenwald to carry out Sigmar's justice. The Burning Crusade. Eisenwald was no ordinary witch hunter. He was a man forged in war, hardened by fire, tempered by suffering. A warrior of faith, his silver armor was adorned with the hammer of Sigmar and the skull of a vampire he had slain with his own hands. His eyes burned with divine hatred, his face scarred from a battle long past, his black cloak heavy with the weight of centuries of warfare against the unnatural. His sword, the light of vengeance, was bathed in the blessings of the Grand Theogonist himself, forged from meteoric silver that seared through undead flesh like fire through dry parchment. He had made a career of slaughtering vampires, had burned entire bloodlines from the face of the world, hunted the hidden courts of the Lamians, the necromantic horrors of Sylvania, and the corrupt lords of the von Karsteins. But never before had he seen anything like this. A civil war. Vampire against vampire. Blood dragon against blood dragon. It was a perfect opportunity. If the dead have turned on each other, Eisenwald said, addressing his gathered commanders, then we will make sure none of them walk away from this war alive. Sigmar's light will burn them from this land. The crusade had begun. The march of righteous fire. The Empire moved like a storm, its forces sweeping down into the border princes with unyielding fury. At Eisenwald's command, a legion of Templars of Sigmar, devout warrior priests and seasoned witch hunters rode forth. Behind them, imperial detachments of great swords and handgunners, steam tanks and war priests, the full wrath of Sigmarite faith armed for war. Entire villages were purged, their fields salted, their wells cleansed of the taint of undeath. Vampiric covens were hunted down, dragged from their lairs and burned alive beneath Sigmar's holy sun. Necromantic artifacts were shattered, their cursed magic undone by the wrath of the divine. The Empire would not be stopped, and soon the blood dragons would realize that their war had drawn the attention of something far deadlier than each other. The vampires learn of the crusade. In Blackspire Keep, far from the crusading forces, Varo stood before a burning map, watching as the Empire's armies moved southward like a sea of steel and fire. "They come for us." Druska grunted, sharpening his blade. "Good, let them." Varo's golden eyes narrowed. "You misunderstand. They do not come to fight us. They come to wipe us out." The Empire was not like Serion, nor Vedrek. The Empire did not play at war. It eradicated threats. And if Varo's army and Sarion's traitors did not prepare, they would all die. He turned to Gregor the Hollow, the necromancer watching the flames with an amused grin. "What do you know of Eisenwald?" Gregor chuckled. "Aid is a man who believes himself righteous. That makes him dangerous. He has slain many of our kind. Lamians, von Karsteins, even the stray necrarch too foolish to hide. But he is no fool. He will not waste his forces fighting a war on two fronts. Varos's mind raced. The crusade was a problem, but also an opportunity. If he could turn this war against Sarion into something bigger, if he could use the Empire's crusade to weaken his enemies, then Drakenhold could still be his. But how? Sarion's response. Meanwhile, in Drakenhold, Sarion sat upon Varos's former throne, his hands gripping the armrests of black iron, his golden eyes watching as his commanders reported the movements of the Imperial forces. One of his lieutenants, Dane Veda of the Crimson Hunt, knelt before him. "The witch hunters march for us," she said, her voice low. "They will be here in weeks." Sarion grinned. "Then let them come." Unlike Varos, he saw no threat. The Empire was just another enemy to conquer. "We will not flee. We will break them." He stood, his black cape flowing behind him, stepping down the cold steps of the throne room. "Prepare the garrison. Sharpen your swords. Let the Empire throw itself upon our walls. When their crusade ends, it will be our banners flying over their graves." His knights roared in approval, their bloodlust unchained. The Empire had come to destroy them, but Sarion would make them suffer first. The war escalates. The civil war of the blood dragons had been chaos. Now it had become a war for survival. The Empire was marching. Eisenwald had sworn to burn the border princes clean of the undead. Varos and Sarion both prepared for the coming storm, and in the distance Vaedric's undead horde watched with quiet amusement. The border princes had become a battlefield of gods and monsters, and soon no one would be left standing. Chapter 15. The Fall of the Hound. A war within a war. The fortress of Drakenhold was in chaos. The civil war of the blood dragons had reached its boiling point, and Lord Karthus the Hound, once Sarion's most trusted warlord, had turned against him. Betrayal had beget betrayal, and now the war within the walls of Drakenhold was as brutal as the one beyond them. The throne room burned, the banners of the blood dragons torn from the walls, and the black stone corridors ran slick with fresh blood. Karthus had believed he would take Drakenhold for himself, but his mistake had not been turning on Sarion. His mistake had been unleashing something far worse. For in his desperation he had freed the thing that should have remained buried. The blood fiend, and now it had come for him. The betrayer stands alone. Karthus staggered through the ruined halls, his armor dented, his blade coated in the blood of his former allies. The battle against Sarion's loyalists had gone poorly. His forces had been outnumbered, outmatched, their betrayal met with a counter-strike of brutal efficiency. And now he stood alone. His warriors lay in pieces, their bodies piled against the burning remains of the great doors of Drakenhold. Sarion had not even needed to kill him himself. He had let Karthus's own arrogance do that. Karthus gritted his teeth, spitting blood onto the floor. "Damn you, Sarion," he growled. "Damn you and all your cursed blood." Then, from the darkness behind him, something moved. Karthus froze. A low, wet breathing filled the hall. Something massive stirred within the shadows, its claws scraping against the stone, its eyes burning with unnatural hunger. And then it stepped into the light. The blood fiend, a creature of nightmare, a vampire twisted beyond recognition, warped into something monstrous. Something that should not exist. It had grown. The last time Varos had faced it, it had been a hulking nightmare of clawed limbs and skeletal hunger. Now it was even worse. Its form was shifting, its limbs elongating unnaturally, its ribcage distended as though something inside it was constantly writhing. It had fed, and it was still feeding. Its blackened maw opened, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth, dripping with the blood of knights long dead. Karthus raised his sword, stepping back. "You are not of my kind," he snarled. "You are a thing that should not be." The blood fiend did not answer. It did not speak. It only hungered. And then it moved. The butchering of the hound. Karthus was no coward. He charged, his massive blade cleaving down with the strength of a monster in human form. The blood fiend did not flinch. It caught the blade with one hand. The steel bit into its flesh, but no blood came. Instead, it gripped the weapon, claws curling around the steel, and with a sickening crunch, it snapped the sword in half. Karthus barely had time to react before the blood fiend struck. Its clawed arm whipped out, carving through his chestplate, sending him crashing against the broken stone walls. His ribs shattered, pain exploding through his body. But he was a blood dragon. He would not die so easily. With a roar he lunged again, claws bared, fangs flashing. "I am a blood dragon, you cannot—" The blood fiend caught him midair. With inhuman strength, it slammed him into the floor, stone cracking beneath the force of the impact. Karthus choked on his own blood, his vision blurring. And then the blood fiend opened its maw, and it fed. The devouring. The blood fiend's fangs tore into Karthus's throat, its jaws locking with unnatural force, ripping through flesh and bone alike. Karthus screamed, his body convulsing violently, his lifeblood draining into the monster's waiting maw. But this was not the death of a man. This was something worse. The blood fiend was not just killing him. It was consuming him, drinking not just his blood, but his very essence, his strength, his soul. The more it drank, the larger it became, its muscles shifting, its form twisting into something even more grotesque. Its eyes burned brighter, its limbs cracked as they expanded, its ribcage bursting outward in an explosion of flesh before reforming anew. It had absorbed him, and Karthus the Hound was no more. The horror grows. When the feeding ended, the blood fiend stood taller, its shadow stretching across the ruined hall. It turned its burning eyes toward the dead knights littering the battlefield. And then it laughed, a sound not meant for mortal ears, a sound that should not come from any creature. The sound of madness. It was evolving. It was becoming something more, and it would never stop feeding. Sarion stood upon the battlements of Drakenhold, watching from above. He had seen Karthus betray him. He had seen Karthus fall. And now he saw the blood fiend standing over his corpse. For the first time, Sarion felt something close to fear. This was not just a monster. This was something far worse. This was what they had all feared becoming. And now it was free. Varos's warning. Far from Drakenhold, Varos stood atop a ruined tower, watching the distant flames that burned in the keep of his stolen throne. Draskar and Isolde stood beside him, watching in silence. Gregor the Hollow smiled to himself. "I told you," the necromancer whispered, "the seals are breaking." Varos exhaled slowly. "The blood fiend has grown stronger." Draskar spat onto the ground. "Let it eat Sarion, then we kill it ourselves." Varos's golden eyes burned. "No, if it keeps feeding, there will be nothing left to kill." The war had changed again. Now they were not just fighting for a throne. They were fighting for survival. The blood fiend had grown, and soon it would not stop at the blood dragons. It would devour the world. Chapter 16. The Siege of Drakenhold. The last war begins. The winds howled through the jagged peaks surrounding Drakenhold, carrying the scent of war and ruin. The once impregnable fortress of the blood dragons, a monument to Varos' rule, now stood drenched in treachery and bathed in unnatural darkness. The blood fiend's presence had twisted the air, warping the very foundation of the once proud stronghold. And now Varos had returned, not as a lord seeking his throne, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a conqueror. And this night, Dragonholt would fall. The march of the exiled. Varos stood at the head of his army, his golden eyes burning like fire, his crimson armor reflecting the torches of the thousands behind him. The exiled blood dragons, the knights who had remained loyal to their oaths, stood ready. Draskar the Dread, his massive greatsword resting on his shoulder, his hunger for battle evident in his fanged grin. Dame Isolde the Silent, standing like a phantom in her obsidian plate, her twin daggers dripping with the blood of Cerian's spies. Gregor the Hollow, his skeletal hands raised toward the heavens, dark magic swirling around him as he called forth the spirits of the slain. Behind them, an army of vampires, mortal mercenaries, and risen dead stretched across the valley. Black-armored blood knights rode atop skeletal steeds, their red cloaks fluttering like banners of war. Mortals who had sworn themselves to Varos stood in grim silence, their faces painted with the realization that they marched toward death. Necromantic horrors, raised by Gregor, lurched forward, twisted amalgamations of flesh and bone ready to be unleashed. And ahead of them, Drakenhold, the bastion of treachery, and Cerian's last refuge. The usurper prepares for war. Inside the fortress, Cerion von Vargai stood atop the blackstone battlements, watching the approaching army with an expression of cold fury. Drakenhold had once belonged to him without question. Now he was reduced to a cornered beast. His forces were weakened by Karthus' betrayal. The blood fiend still lurked in the depths of his fortress, feeding on his fallen knights, growing stronger by the day. And now Varos was here. So the exile returns, Cerion muttered, gripping the hilt of his blade tightly. Dame Veda of the Crimson Hunt, his most loyal general, stood beside him, her golden eyes narrowing as she studied the approaching army. "We cannot hold the walls forever, my lord." "Then we will not." Cerion turned, his cloak whipping in the wind, his fangs bared. If Varos wants his throne back, he will have to fight for it inside these walls. Let them breach the gates. Let them come. We will drown them in their own blood. He raised his sword high, and the knights of Drakenhold roared in defiance. The last stand of the traitors had begun. The storm breaks. The first assault came with fire. Varos' catapults launched flaming stones, the skies above Drakenhold painted in streaks of burning light. Walls cracked. Gates splintered. Cerion's forces returned fire with their own war machines, but it was not enough to stop the tide. Then the charge came. Varos led his knights forward, the ground shaking beneath the thunder of hooves and the pounding of steel-clad boots. For Abhorash, for honor. The battering rams struck the gates with the force of 1,000 war cries, the massive iron doors groaning under the relentless assault. From the walls, Cerion's archers unleashed a rain of black-fletched arrows, cutting down mortal mercenaries like wheat before the scythe. But Varos did not stop. His knights slammed against the gates once more. And then, with a deafening boom, the gates of Drakenhold shattered. The fortress was open, and the real battle had begun. The carnage within. The courtyards of Drakenhold became a slaughterhouse. Varos's knights clashed with Cerion's warriors, the sound of steel on steel echoing like thunder. Draskar carved through traitors like a beast unchained, his sword leaving trails of severed limbs and broken armor. Isolde danced between enemies, her daggers finding the soft points of armor, leaving knights to choke on their own blood. Gregor the Hollow's dark magic raised the fallen, turning Cerion's own dead against him. But Cerion was no coward. He waded into battle himself, his blade cutting through nights like parchment, his golden eyes burning with fury. "Varos!" His roar echoed across the battlefield, a challenge. And Varos heard it. The duel for Drakenhold. Varos moved through the chaos, his golden eyes locking onto Syrian, his former brother, his betrayer. The two warriors met in the courtyard, their armies battling around them, but for that moment, there was only each other. Syrian smiled, raising his blade. "I should have killed you when I had the chance." Varos raised his own sword, his voice cold as steel. "You never had the chance." And then they clashed. Steel rang against steel, sparks flying into the air as their blades struck with inhuman force. Syrian moved like a shadow, his blade darting forward, seeking to end the fight in a single strike. Varos parried, countered, struck back, his greatsword carving a deep gash across Syrian's armor. Blood splattered across the stone, but Syrian did not fall. He lunged, his blade piercing Varos's side, sinking deep into flesh and bone. Varos snarled, but did not falter. With a roar, he ripped the blade from his body, spun, and drove his own sword through Syrian's chest. The traitor gasped, blood spilling from his lips. Varos stepped closer, his face inches from Syrian's. "Drakenhold was never yours?" Varos twisted the blade, and Syrian von Vargeist fell. Victory? The fortress burned. Syrian's knights fell to their knees, their lord slain, their will broken. Varos stood atop the steps of the keep, his sword still dripping with the blood of his enemy. Drakenhold was his again. But in the distance, a sound, a low, inhuman laughter, and then a roar of hunger. The blood fiend had awakened, and it was not finished feeding. Chapter 17. Duel of the Betrayed. The death of a tyrant. The once proud fortress of Drakenhold burned, its black stone walls bathed in the fire and blood of its defenders. Syrian's knights lay broken in the ruins of the courtyard, their armored corpses stacked in grotesque mounds. The banners of the traitors had been torn down, their sigils defaced, their loyalty reduced to ashes. The battle was over. But the war was not, because at the heart of the carnage, standing in the center of the shattered great hall, were two warriors, their eyes locked, their blades drawn. Two blood dragons, two brothers in war, and only one would leave this place alive. The last duel. Varos stood over the corpse-strewn battlefield, his golden eyes never leaving Syrian. The usurper stood with his back against the great throne, his black armor cracked, his breath ragged, his sword still dripping with the blood of fallen knights. Varos's own crimson plate was streaked with fresh wounds, his side still torn open from their earlier clash, but he felt nothing but cold purpose. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Syrian chuckled darkly, rolling his shoulders. "You think I wanted you dead?" Varos narrowed his gaze. "You stole my throne. You led our own brothers against me. You shattered the honor of our order." Syrian's smile was cruel. "If you believe this war was about a throne, then you are still blind." He raised his sword, his golden eyes flashing. "Come then, Lord of Drakenhold. Let us see if you deserve your crown." And then they moved. A battle of gods and monsters. The first strike sent shockwaves through the hall, their blades ringing like a bell of war, the force of their clash shattering the stone beneath them. Syrian lunged, his blade a blur of black steel, cutting toward Varos's throat with inhuman speed. Varos twisted, the attack missing him by inches, his own greatsword coming down in a brutal counterstrike. Syrian parried, but the force sent him stumbling back. Varos pressed forward. A downward strike meant to cleave through armor, Syrian sidestepped, slashing at Varos' side. A riposte, quick and precise. Varos dodged, his gauntlet catching Sarion's wrist, twisting, breaking. A final lunge. Sarion spun, his blade cutting across Varos' chest, but Varos' greatsword struck first. The tip of Varos's blade drove deep into Sarion's gut, piercing through chainmail, muscle, and bone. Sarion let out a snarl of pain, but instead of falling, he lunged forward, his own blade slamming through Varos' shoulder, punching through the crimson plate. For a moment they were locked together, bleeding, fangs bared, eyes blazing with hatred. Neither would step back. Neither would yield. But only one had the strength to finish it. Varos ripped his sword free with a savage twist, carving Sarion open from stomach to spine. Sarion let out a choked gasp, blood pouring from his lips, his knees buckling as he staggered backward. His sword fell from his grip, clattering against the ruined stone. He dropped to one knee, his hand pressed against his torn chest, his own lifeblood spilling onto the ground of the throne he had stolen. Varos loomed over him, his greatsword raised for the final blow. "This is over, Sarion." Sarion laughed, blood dripping from his fangs. "You think? You've won." Varos's brow furrowed. Sarion smiled, a cruel, broken grin. "You were never the true enemy, Varos." "Neither was I." Varos's grip on his sword tightened. "What are you talking about?" Sarion coughed, spitting more blood. Then he looked up, and Varos saw something in his eyes. Not hatred, not fear, but acceptance, as though he had known this moment would come all along. "The war was never about us." Sarion's breath hitched, his voice a whisper between choking gasps. "You never wondered why everything fell apart so easily." Varos stared down at him. Then Sarion's smile widened. "Something is buried beneath Drakenhold, and it wanted us to fight." Varos' entire body went cold. "Lie." Sarion let out a final, breathless chuckle. "You already know. It's true." And then he died. The throne of Drakenhold. Varos stood in silence, staring down at the corpse of his greatest enemy. The great hall was quiet now, the battle having ended, the only sounds the crackling of torches and the whisper of the wind through broken stone. Sarion was dead. Drakenhold was his once more. But his words lingered. Something was buried beneath Drakenhold. Something that had orchestrated the war. Something that had wanted them to fight. And as Varos stood upon the ruined throne, his golden eyes flickering in the darkness, he felt a presence beneath him. Something stirred in the catacombs below. Something old. Something hungry. Sarion had not been lying. And this war was far from over. Far below, something awakens. Deep beneath Drakenhold, buried within the forgotten crypts, something shifted. The earth trembled. Chains creaked against stone. Runes etched in blood pulsed with sickly light. A voice, low and terrible, whispered through the darkness. "At last the gate is open." And then a pair of eyes opened in the abyss, golden, ancient, and filled with hunger. Chapter 18. The Awakening of Vokhmar. The blood that spoke to the dead. The ruins of Drakenhold still smoldered, the fires of battle fading into the cold, suffocating silence of victory. The bodies of vampires and mortals alike lay strewn across the broken stones, their lifeblood seeping into the cracks of the ancient fortress. Sarion was dead. The war should have been over, but the blood did not settle. It moved. It drifted through the corridors, creeping through the foundations of the fortress as if pulled by an unseen force. It flowed down into the crypts below, through passages that had been sealed for centuries, through tunnels that no living thing had dared to tread. And deep beneath Drakenhold, something stirred. Something that had been waiting. The throng of the dead. Varos stood over the lifeless corpse of Sarion, his golden eyes unblinking, his greatsword still slick with his enemy's blood. His army cheered his name, their voices rising in the cold night air, a chorus of victory that should have filled him with triumph. But he felt none. Sarion's final words clawed at his mind. Something is buried beneath Drakenhold, and it wanted us to fight. A chill crept down Varos' spine, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with wind or winter. Then the ground shook. Not from the marching of his warriors, not from the impact of distant siege engines. Something else, something from below. "Do you hear that?" Isolde asked, stepping to his side. Draskar scowled, his massive arms crossed, his grip tightening around his sword. "Something's wrong." Then, from below, a sound, a low, wet whisper, like rotted flesh pulling itself free from the embrace of the grave. And then a voice, ancient, cold, amused. "Who has spilled such precious blood upon my tomb?" The fortress trembled, and Drakenhold's deepest secret awoke. The crypts of the Crimson Lich. Deep beneath the fortress, behind seals older than empires, the great tomb split apart. The chains of black iron once wrapped around its obsidian sarcophagus snapped with a deafening crack. The runes carved into the stone, glowing with a faint crimson light, flickered and died, their ancient power undone by the blood that had seeped into the earth. The tomb groaned open, dust and ash spilling from within. And from the darkness a figure rose. Tall, impossibly tall, a form draped in tattered crimson robes, the fabric shifting unnaturally as if caught between worlds. A crown of iron sat upon its brow, rusted and broken, yet still radiating power. His flesh was withered, stretched thin over bones that seemed carved from shadow, and its eyes burned like twin suns, golden and cruel, filled with the knowledge of 1,000 years of undeath. Vokhmar had returned. The Lich walks again. The crypt walls cracked and groaned, the very stones recoiling at the presence of their master. With a slow, deliberate motion, Vokhmar stepped forward, his feet never quite touching the ground, his movements unnatural, fluid, like a corpse suspended in water. He raised one withered hand, his bony fingers curling as he gestured to the dead knights around him. And they moved. The slain blood dragons, their bodies broken and lifeless, began to rise. Their eyes, once filled with rage and honor, now burned with sickly red light. Their armor clattered as they stood, swords hanging limp at their sides. But these were not revenants, not mere undead thralls. These were his legion, bound in undeath, sworn in death. And now they would march again. Above, the horror revealed. The ground above cracked. The halls of Drakenhold split apart, the very foundation of the keep fracturing as the crypts vomited forth their long-forgotten master. Varos and his warriors staggered back as the stone beneath their feet trembled, a great fissure tearing through the throne room. Then the figure emerged. Slowly, rising from the depths, Vokhmar ascended through the broken stone, his robes trailing behind him like a river of blood. His golden eyes swept over the battlefield, filled not with anger nor hunger, but amusement. A voice like a dying breath echoed through the hall. "So much blood, so much death, and yet none of you knew what you truly fought for." Varos gritted his teeth, his blade raised. "Who are you?" Vokhmar tilted his head, his skeletal lips curling into something resembling a smile. "You speak my name, but do not know me. I am the architect of your war, the shadow beneath your throne. I am the first of the Crimson Court, the one Abhorash could not kill. And now I am free. The true war begins." Varos lunged, his blade flashing toward the Lich's throat. But before he could strike, Vokhmar simply raised a hand. And Varos froze. His entire body locked in place, his limbs refusing to obey, his muscles paralyzed by some unseen force. Vokhmar leaned in, his rotting lips curling in amusement. Still bound by honor, still shackled by the code of your kind. You fight for a throne that was never truly yours. You believe this war had meaning, but you are nothing more than pawns in a game played long before you drew your first breath. The air grew heavy, the walls trembling as a dark mist began to creep from the depths of the crypts below. Vokhmar's voice lowered to a whisper. You did not reclaim Drakenhold. You opened its gate. And then the dead screamed. From the cracks in the stone, wraiths, skeletal horrors, and twisted abominations poured forth, their souls bound in servitude to the Crimson Lich. Varos' knights cried out in alarm, blades rising, shields locking, but it was too late. They were no longer the conquerors. They were the prey. The hunt begins. Vokhmar spread his arms, his golden eyes blazing like miniature suns. The crypts of Drakenhold had broken open, and now the forgotten horrors of the ancient world had returned. You fought for a crown that means nothing. Now you will kneel before a king who never died, or you will be consumed. And as his undead horde surged forward, as the shadows of Drakenhold came alive with things that had not walked the earth in 1,000 years, Varos realized one chilling truth. Assyrian had been right. The war was never theirs to win. It was his, and Vokhmar had already won. Chapter 19. The Gathering Storm. A Throne of Bone. A War for the Bloodline. The ruins of Drakenhold were no longer a fortress, they were a graveyard. The dead walked freely now, their hollow eyes burning with the sickly crimson light of the Crimson Lich. The air stank of rot and blackened magic, and the very stone of the castle walls pulsed like dying flesh, corrupted by whatever horror Vokhmar had brought back into the world. Varos had fought wars before. He had bled for his throne. He had slain his betrayer. But this was no war for kings or glory. This was a war for survival, and it was only just beginning. The retreat from Drakenhold. Varos and his surviving warriors fled through the broken gates, the fortress collapsing behind them as the dead consumed its halls. Draskar the Dread carved through the risen corpses with brutal, mindless fury, his great sword splitting bone and sinew as he covered their retreat. Isolde the Silent moved like a phantom, her daggers slashing the throats of those once sworn to their cause, now puppets of the Crimson Lich. Gregor the Hollow muttered dark incantations, his fingers tracing runes in the air, binding spectral wraiths to hold back the advancing tide. But Vokhmar's army was endless. Every fallen knight became another soldier in his ranks. Every warrior that bled upon Drakenhold's cursed stones only fed the Lich's growing power. Varos gritted his teeth as he swung his greatsword, cleaving through a revenant knight whose skull had already been shattered, yet still fought as though it felt no pain. The dead did not break. They did not retreat, and they were only getting stronger. "We cannot win here," Gregor shouted over the chaos. "Fall back to Blackspire. We make our stand there." Varos cursed under his breath, but he knew Gregor was right. They had lost Drakenhold. For now. Retreat. The surviving blood dragons turned, breaking away from the battlefield, their war horses galloping into the night, their banners tattered, their pride bleeding. The undead did not pursue, because Vokhmar did not need to chase them. He had already won this battle. And he knew where they would go next. Blackspire Keep, the last bastion. Days passed. What remained of Varos' war host gathered at Blackspire Keep, the ancient stronghold of the exiled blood dragons. The walls were thick, the gates heavy with iron, and the towers bristled with warriors preparing for war. But no fortress could keep them safe forever. Inside the keep, the surviving warlords of the blood dragons gathered in the dim torchlight of the great hall. The air was tense. For the first time since the blood dragons had turned on each other, they all stood in the same room, not as enemies, but as brothers facing extinction. The Council of the Doomed. Varos stood before them, his golden eyes burning. He had spent his life fighting for honor, for strength, for the right to rule. But now, none of it mattered, because if they lost this war, there would be no blood dragons left to rule. Vokhmar is no mere vampire. He is something older, something worse, and he will not stop until we are all in his thrall. A murmur spread through the assembled knights. Then, from the shadows, Duke Alaric the Pale, one of the oldest remaining blood dragon lords, spoke. You ask us to unite, but why should we fight for a lost cause? Varos turned his gaze upon him. Because if we do not, there will be nothing left of our bloodline. You saw what happened at Drakenhold. Vokhmar does not simply kill, he devours. He twists our dead into his puppets. He took a step forward, his voice rising like a war cry. This is no longer about thrones or honor. This is a war for our very existence. Silence. Then Draskar the Dread slammed his greatsword into the stone floor. I do not kneel to tyrants, but I will not stand by and watch my bloodline be turned into wretched thralls. We fight. One by one the warlords nodded. Lady Veda of the Crimson Hunt, her golden eyes burning with savage fury. The Black Grail Knights, cursed warriors from Bretonia, sworn only to serve the strongest. The remnants of the iron-clad legion, exiled blood knights whose armor bore the scars of 100 wars. For the first time since the war began, the blood dragons were united, and they would make their last stand together. The war begins anew. The fortress gates were sealed, the banners of the blood dragons raised high. Every warrior sharpened their blade, knowing it would soon taste undead flesh. Gregor the Hollow stood atop the highest tower, his withered hands scribing runes in the air, preparing the fortress for the dark magics to come. Draskar oversaw the training of mortal soldiers, warriors who fought despite knowing they would not live to see the dawn. Varos stood at the highest battlement, staring toward the horizon. The sky was darkening. The air grew heavy. Then, on the distant hills, they appeared. A black tide of undead warriors, their golden eyes glowing in the mist, marching toward Blackspire like a swarm of locusts. At their head, Vokhmar the Crimson Lich. His crimson robes billowed like the banners of a long-forgotten empire, his crown of bone glinting in the moonlight. He raised one skeletal hand, and the dead halted. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the battlefield like a whisper from the grave. You cannot stop what has already begun. You cannot kill what has never truly lived. Surrender your souls to me, and I will spare you the agony of fighting a war you cannot win. Varos raised his sword, his voice cutting through the night. Come and take them, then. Vokhmar laughed. The dead surged forward, and the final war began. Chapter 20. The Last Oath. The War of the Damned. The skies above Blackspire Keep burned with an unnatural red, as if the heavens themselves wept blood in anticipation of the slaughter to come. The undead legions of Vokhmar had surrounded the fortress, their golden eyes flickering like torches in the mist, their ranks stretching across the horizon like an endless tide of death. At the head of this damned army, Vokhmar the Crimson Lich stood unmoving, his crowned skull tilting ever so slightly, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. Varos watched from the highest tower, his golden eyes cold and unblinking. Beneath him, his knights prepared for war. Draskar the Dread gathered the mortal warriors, their steel useless against Vokhmar's horrors, but their will unbroken. Isolde the Silent sharpened her daggers, whispering prayers to gods who had long since stopped listening. Gregor the Hollow traced runes into the stone, dark magic weaving around his skeletal fingers as he prepared the dead for war. The final battle was near. But Varos was not ready. Not yet. There was one thing left to do. A pilgrimage of blood. Varos descended into the darkest depths of Blackspire Keep, where even the torches dared not burn. Here, in the forgotten crypts, among the bones of long-dead warriors, he sought something older than magic, older than war, something that would decide the fate of this battle. He reached the deepest chamber, where the walls were etched with carvings so ancient they predated even the Empire. The sigil of Abhorash was carved into the stone, its edges sharp, untouched by time. The first and greatest of the blood dragons, the one who had forsaken the hunger, the one who had sought strength beyond the thirst. Varos knelt before the sigil, pressing his gauntleted fist against his chest, bowing his head. His voice was low, steady, unshaken. Master Abhorash, I stand at the edge of the abyss. This war is not for power, not for vengeance, but for survival. The bloodline you forged is at risk of annihilation. The strength you taught us is all that remains. Varos drew his sword, laying it across his palms. I swear now, upon my blade, upon my blood, upon my honor, I will not falter. I will not break. I will not give in to the hunger nor the weakness of the lesser breeds. I will fight with strength alone. Through steel, through will, through war, I will prove my worth. And I will cast this pretender into the abyss where he belongs. He pressed his blade against his palm, letting his own blood spill upon the sigil. The stone beneath him trembled. For the briefest moment, he felt something stir. Not magic, not necromancy. Something older, something watching. Then, silence. But Varos did not need an answer, because he already knew what had to be done. He rose, gripping his sword once more. He would not use dark magic. He would not call upon the hunger. He would not taint his blade with weakness. He would fight as a true warrior, as a blood dragon, as Abhorash had intended, and Vokhmar would fall by strength alone. The blood dragons rallied. Varos emerged from the crypts, his golden eyes burning brighter than before. The blood dragons gathered before him, their armor gleaming, their weapons raised. The final war was upon them, and he would lead them to one last battle. No more waiting, no more doubt. We are blood dragons. We were forged for war. We were made to test our strength against the strongest foes. Vokhmar is no god, he is no immortal king, he is just another enemy to be slain. He raised his greatsword, the firelight gleaming off its edge. And we will cut him down like all the others. A roar of steel and blood erupted from the knights. They were ready. Varos turned to the battlefield. Vokhmar was waiting, and so was their destiny. The march to war. The gates of Blackspire Keep groaned as they were thrown open, revealing the sea of undead that lay beyond. The golden eyes of Vokhmar's legions flickered in the darkness, their swords raised, their skeletal fingers clutching rusted steel. And at their head Vokhmar himself stood, his crowned skull staring with amusement. He tilted his head slightly, as if greeting an old friend. Ah, the knight who believes himself unbroken. Varos stepped forward, his sword gripped in both hands. Your mistake, Lich. He smiled, his fangs glinting in the torchlight. Was thinking we were ever broken in the first place. Vokhmar laughed. Then, with one sweeping motion of his hand, the dead surged forward, and the blood dragons charged. The final war had begun. Chapter 21. The Nightmare Legion. The Dark Harvest. The Border Princes burned. From the frozen peaks of the Black Mountains to the war-torn plains of the Blighted Marches, the nightmare legion of Vokhmar descended like a living plague. They did not conquer. They did not enslave. They exterminated. The fall of Dornheim. The fortress city of Dornheim, ruled by the Iron Prince Edric von Kessel, had stood for nearly 3 centuries, its walls repelling countless warbands of orcs, raiders, and mercenaries. But against Vokhmar's legion, stone and steel meant nothing. The attack came at dusk, when the crimson light of Moslib, the cursed moon, hung low in the sky. The gates of Dornheim had been sealed. The walls bristled with archers, their torches illuminating the mist that coiled at the city's base like a living thing. Then the fog moved. Sound the horns. To the walls. The first abomination came forward, its form barely visible in the rolling fog. The archers loosed their arrows. They struck something, but there was no cry of pain. Then the monstrosity stepped into view. A colossal corpse knight, its armor fused to its rotting flesh, its limbs unnaturally elongated, fingers tipped with black claws. Its face was a mockery of humanity, its mouth stretched open into an eternal silent scream, rows of jagged fangs lining its distended jaw. And behind it more came. Hundreds, thousands. Some crawled on all fours, their bodies twisted into things that should not exist. Some walked, their armor rusted, their flesh too tight on bones that had been buried for centuries. And then they charged. The massacre. The first impact shattered Dornheim's outer defenses like glass. The colossal corpse knight hurled itself at the gates, its body exploding into thousands of writhing tendrils, latching onto the wood and iron, tearing it apart in seconds. The archers fired, but their arrows passed through the fog, through flesh that healed instantly, through bodies that did not know pain. They're inside the walls. The streets became a slaughterhouse. Men fought in screaming terror, their swords barely biting into the unnatural flesh of the Nightmare Legion. Witches and priests of Sigmar raised their hands in holy invocation, only for their magic to wither and die as if the gods themselves had abandoned them. The strongest knights of Dornheim, men who had fought orcs and vampires alike, found themselves cut down in moments, their bodies twisted, their souls devoured. The streets ran red, the dead piled high, and in the center of it all, Vokhmar stood, his crimson robes untouched, his golden eyes watching as the world fell to its knees before him. The Iron Prince, Edric von Kessel, once ruler of Dornheim, stood atop the last surviving tower, his sword slick with the blood of the dead. But he was alone, and below the Crimson Lich looked up at him, a man who has ruled, yet never truly lived. "Come down, mortal, you will not escape." Edric did not answer. Instead, he turned his sword upon himself, plunging the blade into his own throat rather than be taken. Vokhmar laughed, and as the tower fell, Dornheim was no more. The cities that fell, the Nightmare Legion did not stop. One by one, the mortal kingdoms of the border princes fell. Elmgate Keep burned in a single night, its defenders turned inside out by Vokhmar's sorceries, their bodies still screaming as they were molded into new horrors. The free city of Brackenhof, its streets once filled with trade and revelry, became a silence-haunted ruin, its people drained of blood and left as withered husks. Castle Arnwolf, whose walls had never fallen, collapsed from within as Vokhmar's whispers drove the defenders to slaughter each other before his army even arrived. No city stood, no army survived. Only death followed in his wake. And his army grew. With every victory, every battlefield, his ranks swelled with the newly risen, bound in undeath, twisted beyond recognition. He was no mere warlord. He was a force beyond death itself. And soon, there would be nothing left to fight him. He approached to Blackspire. As the last of the mortal cities fell, Vokhmar turned his gaze toward the horizon. Beyond the ruined wasteland he had created, the last fortress stood, Blackspire Keep, and within it, Varos and the blood dragons. The final war had come. Vokhmar raised one skeletal hand, gesturing toward his endless army. The bloodline of Abhorash stands defiant. They think themselves warriors, they think themselves kings, but they will learn what all things must learn. There is no throne in death. Only me. With a single motion, he lowered his hand, and the undead surged forward once more, their final destination set. The last warriors of the Blood Dragon line stood before them, and the Nightmare Legion would devour them all. Chapter 22. The Last Stand of the Blood Dragons. The End of an Age. The air was thick with the scent of death. Blackspire Keep, once a fortress of exiled knights, now stood as the last bastion against oblivion. Beyond its ancient walls, Vokhmar's Nightmare Legion gathered in impossible numbers, their golden eyes burning through the mist, their bodies twisted by dark sorcery into things that should not exist. The horizon had vanished beneath the weight of the undead, and soon they would come. But the blood dragons did not kneel. They did not beg. They did not run. Tonight, they would make their last stand, and they would die with steel in hand. A fortress in ruin. Varos stood atop the highest tower, his golden eyes scanning the battlefield below. The fortress walls were thick, but it would not matter. The gates, once ironclad, had already been cracked by Vokhmar's magic. The towers had crumbled under the weight of previous battles. The banners of the blood dragons still flew, but they were tattered, soaked in the blood of fallen warriors. And yet, despite everything, his knights still stood ready. Draskar the Dread sharpened his sword, his grin a savage thing, his armor dented but unbroken. Isolde the Silent moved through the ranks, her daggers slick with the blood of the last spies that had tried to betray them. Rega the Hollow whispered to the spirits of the dead, calling forth the last of his power, preparing for the final battle. They knew the truth. This was the end. But they would not go quietly. The oath before death. Varos descended into the courtyard, where his warriors waited in silence. These were not broken men. These were not knights who feared the dark. These were blood dragons. We were born into war, he said, his voice like iron upon stone. We were made for battle, and though we stand at the edge of ruin, we will not fall in disgrace. He drew his greatsword, holding it aloft as the torches flickered against the steel. No hunger will claim us. No fear will break us. We fight not for survival, but for honor. He turned, his gaze locking onto each of them. And we will die as warriors. The knights roared in response, their voices shaking the very stones beneath them. This was no army of desperate men. This was a warrior order standing against the end of time, and they would fight until the last drop of blood was spilled. The enemy comes. From the mist beyond the gates, a horn sounded, a low, dreadful call, like the wailing of the damned. The ground trembled, the dead shifting as one, their burning eyes locking onto the keep like hungry wolves. At their head, Vokhmar stood motionless, his crimson robes untouched by the wind, his golden eyes staring through the walls, through flesh and stone, through time itself. And then he spoke. Your bloodline ends tonight. Your order is forgotten. You will bow before me, or you will become part of the Legion. Varos stepped forward, standing atop the gates of Blackspire, his greatsword resting upon his shoulder. He met Vokhmar's gaze, unblinking. Then he smiled. Then come and take us. Vokhmar raised his hand, and the dead surged forward. The first clash. The first impact was a storm of blood and steel. The Nightmare Legion crashed against the walls, their clawed hands tearing into stone, their skeletal steeds leaping over the battlements, their twisted war beasts smashing through barricades as if they were paper. Draskar roared like a beast, his greatsword carving through rotting flesh and blackened armor, his laughter echoing through the carnage. Isolde moved like a shadow, her daggers finding gaps in armor, slicing through the exposed throats of the risen dead before vanishing into the chaos. Gregor the Hollow unleashed his magic, calling upon the restless spirits of warriors past, binding them to the last defenders of Blackspire, giving them strength beyond death. For a moment it seemed as if they could hold. Then the walls cracked. Vokhmar raised both hands, and the very earth beneath the keep trembled. The stones of Blackspire began to splinter, the old wards failing, the ancient defenses collapsing under the weight of the Lich's unholy power. And then the gates broke. The slaughter within. The dead poured in like a flood, swarming over the remaining knights, dragging them down in a frenzy of claws and broken teeth. Varos fought without hesitation, his sword a whirlwind of death, carving through Vokhmar's horrors with every stroke. A hulking white warrior lunged at him. Varos sidestepped, his blade cleaving its skull in two. The corpse knight with rusted armor swung low. Varos caught the blade with his gauntlet, twisted, and rammed his sword through its ribs. A skeletal monstrosity, its body wrapped in chains, surged forward. Varos drove his blade through its spine, twisting until it shattered. But for every undead he cut down, 10 more took its place. And his warriors were dying. One by one, the blood dragons fell. Draskar was pulled beneath a wave of undead, his roars turning to silence. Isolde vanished into the darkness, surrounded on all sides, her daggers still flashing even as the dead tore into her. Gregor the Hollow screamed as his own magic was turned against him, his body unraveling in a vortex of black energy. Varos was alone, the last knight of Abhorash. He stood in the center of the ruined courtyard, his sword dripping with black ichor, the bodies of his brothers lying at his feet. The dead halted, parting like a sea. Vokhmar stepped forward, his golden eyes burning. "Look around you, Varos. You are the last." Varos did not respond. He simply raised his sword once more. "Then I will be the last to die." Vokhmar smiled. Then he raised his hand, and the final battle began. Chapter 23. The Curse of the Blood Fiend. A monster unchained. The ruins of Blackspire Keep were soaked in blood. The walls had fallen, the gates shattered, and the last knights of the blood dragons lay dead or undead, twisted into mindless thralls beneath Vokhmar's will. Varus stood alone, his greatsword weighed down with the gore of 100 slain horrors, his armor broken, his flesh torn, but his spirit unbroken. Before him, Vokhmar the Crimson Lich, robed in the colors of ancient death, his crowned skull tilted in amusement. "You fought well, Varus, but this war was never yours to win." Behind him, the blood fiend stirred. It had grown monstrous, no longer the hulking nightmare bound by hunger, but something else, something worse. Its twisted form writhed with exposed muscle and bone, veins pulsing with stolen vitae, its golden eyes burning with the same cruel light as Vokhmar's. It had fed upon the battlefield. It had grown stronger with every night that fell, and now it was something beyond even the dead. Varos breathed heavily, gripping his sword. He could not win, but he could still fight, and he would not die cowering. Then a voice rang through the battlefield, ragged and laughing through the smoke. Gregor the Hollow staggered from the wreckage, his skeletal frame barely holding together, his robes soaked in the black ichor of fallen revenants. "Ha! Vokhmar, you really think yourself a god?" Vokhmar's golden gaze snapped to the necromancer, his skeletal fingers twitching. "You should be dead." Gregor grinned, his half-rotted lips peeling back. "Oh, I am. But that doesn't mean I can't speak one last truth before you finish the job." He coughed, blood spilling from his gaping wounds, but still he smirked, his dead eyes gleaming with something far more dangerous than fear: knowledge. "Tell me, great Lich, have you never wondered why the blood fiend grows stronger with every war? It does not simply die, but becomes more." Varus's brow furrowed as he slowly turned his gaze toward the monstrous creature behind Vokhmar. The Lich said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Gregor chuckled. "Oh, you already know, don't you?" The truth unveiled. The ground trembled beneath the blood fiend's massive form, its spine snapping and twisting as if something was shifting inside it. It let out a low, guttural growl, its fangs bared, its eyes flickering between bestial hunger and unnatural awareness. It was changing. Gregor limped forward, ignoring the dead all around him, his voice rising despite his failing body. "This thing isn't just a monster. It is you, Vokhmar, or at least the part of you that still desires something beyond undeath." Varos's eyes widened. Vokhmar's golden gaze darkened. "Lie," Gregor laughed, despite the blood in his throat. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. You knew this deep down. Why else would you keep it chained beneath Drakenhold for so long? Why else would you seal away the one thing that could grow stronger than even you?" He gestured toward the blood fiend, his bony fingers trembling. "This thing is not just a creature that feeds on war. It is war, the essence of every battle, every betrayal, every fallen knight. It all feeds back into it." Gregor grinned, his sunken eyes flashing. "It is your soul, Vokhmar, the last living part of you, the nightmare unleashed." The blood fiend convulsed violently, its massive hands clutching at its own body, its claws raking through flesh as if trying to tear something free. The golden light in its eyes flickered, as if some hidden memory had surfaced. For the first time since its awakening, the beast hesitated. Vokhmar's expression did not change, but his fingers twitched. "This is irrelevant." He raised one hand, his fingers crackling with crimson energy. "It belongs to me, and I will bind it once more." The blood fiend's form twisted, its limbs snapping back into place, the air distorting around it as Vokhmar's will clamped down like chains. For a moment it froze, trembling. Then it screamed, a howl of pure, absolute rage. And the bindings shattered. The Lich staggered backward, his golden eyes widening in shock as the blood fiend tore free from his grasp. The beast threw back its head and roared, the sound splitting the air, sending waves of energy rippling across the battlefield. And then it turned, not toward Varos, not toward the scattered remnants of the blood dragons. It turned on Vokhmar, and it lunged. The battle of gods and monsters. The ground cracked beneath its charge, the air splitting as the beast hurled itself at the Lich with impossible speed. For the first time in centuries, Vokhmar moved in true desperation. His hands flashed with dark magic, his robes billowing as he summoned forth runes of power meant to bind the beast once more. But the blood fiend was no longer a slave. It was Vokhmar's own darkness made flesh, and it would not be caged again. The first impact sent shockwaves through the battlefield, the Lich's crimson aura flickering wildly as the beast's claws raked through his form. Varos could only watch. Gregor grinned through bloody teeth. "Seems like your soul is tired of playing servant, Lich." Vokhmar snarled, his once calm voice laced with fury. "I am the master of death itself. I will not, The blood fiend roared, slamming him into the ruined walls of Blackspire Keep. Stone shattered. The knights shook, and for the first time in his cursed existence, Vokhmar bled. The war's true endgame. Varos tightened his grip on his sword, his golden eyes locked on the impossible battle before him. The Lich and his own cursed soul, locked in a battle beyond the realm of the living. But this was not his victory. Not yet. Gregor coughed, dropping to one knee, his body failing. "Varos," he rasped. "Listen to me." Varos knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "What is it?" Gregor's bloody grin widened. "The blood fiend is his weakness. Kill it, and you kill Vokhmar for good." Varos's eyes narrowed. His fingers tightened around his blade. The final battle had changed. He would not just fight Vokhmar. He would sever his soul and end the Crimson Lich forever. Chapter 24. The Shadow of Abhorash. The warrior's final trial. The battlefield was no longer a place of war, it was a place of desolation. The ruins of Blackspire Keep smoldered, its great towers crumbling, its ancient walls split open like a corpse left to rot under the sun. Vokhmar battled his own soul, his undead form locked in a furious struggle against the blood fiend, the very thing that had once been part of him. The Lich's golden eyes burned with fury, his sorcerer lashing out against the beast, trying to shackle it once more. But the blood fiend would not yield. And while the two forces warred, Varos knew this was his only chance. Vokhmar was beyond any warrior's strength. Even if the blood fiend was his weakness, Varos would need more than steel to sever the Lich's cursed existence. He needed something stronger, something ancient, something that had belonged to the greatest warrior of the blood dragons. He needed the relic of Abhorash, the forbidden path. Gregor the Hollow slumped against the ruins, his body broken, his breath shallow, but his voice still sharp. "You seek the shadow of Abhorash." Varos knelt beside him, his armor cracked, his blade still dripping with black ichor. "Where's it?" Gregor coughed, his blood staining the stones beneath him, but his grin never faded. "In the tomb of the first." Varro's eyes narrowed. "The first?" Gregor's skeletal fingers curled slightly, as if grasping something unseen. "The first knights, the first blood dragons. Before Drakenhall, before the Brotherhood was shattered, they entombed Abhorash's legacy deep within the mountains." He let out a ragged breath, his voice a whisper. "A relic of his last war, forged in fire, bound in blood." Gregor looked up, his dead eyes meeting Varos. "It is your only chance. Find it, or die here. Into the depths." Varos did not hesitate. He turned to Isolde, bloodied but unbroken, and Draskar, his armor dented but his fangs still bared in savage defiance. We moved now. The last warriors of the blood dragons did not question him. They knew Vokhmar would not stay distracted forever. If they did not find the relic, they would be hunted, slaughtered, and turned into the very things they despised. With only a handful of warriors left, Varos led them into the darkness of the Black Mountains, where even the Empire feared to tread. They rode through deadlands, through forests that had not known sunlight in centuries, through valleys where the echoes of war still whispered on the wind. The journey was relentless, and at the end of it they found the tomb of the first. The entrance was carved into the cliffs, a monument forgotten by time, hidden beneath centuries of rock and shadow. Massive stone doors stood sealed, their surfaces engraved with runes of old blood magic. The sigil of Abhorash himself burned into the very rock. Varos felt a weight settle over him. This was not a simple grave. This was a trial, and only the strong would claim its prize. "Be ready." The knights drew their blades, and Varos pushed open the doors. The dead that still fought, The tomb was not silent. As soon as they stepped inside, the shadows shifted. Skeletal warriors, wrapped in ancient crimson cloaks, their armor bearing the sigils of the first blood dragons, emerged from the darkness. Their golden eyes flickered, their blades gleaming in the dim torchlight. They had been knights once. Now they were sentinels, guardians of Abhorash's final relic, and they would not let the weak pass. "Test us then," Varos growled, his blade flashing as he stepped forward, "and see if we are worthy." The trial of strength. The battle was a storm of steel. Varos moved like a beast unleashed, his sword cleaving through the ancient undead, their bones shattering beneath his strikes. Draskar tore into them with brute strength, his blade carving through armor, his roars echoing through the tomb. Isolde was a shadow among them, her daggers piercing the gaps in their armor, slicing through bone and dried sinew. The guardians did not scream. They did not fall in pain. They simply fought. Because that was all they had left. One by one they were cut down. And at last the way was clear. The shadow of Abhorash. At the heart of the tomb, in a chamber untouched by time, Varos found it. A blade. Not just any weapon. This was a relic of Abhorash's final war. The hilt was wrapped in blackened steel. The edge still glowed faintly, as if it remembered the blood it had spilled centuries ago. But there was more. A presence. As Varos reached for the blade, a voice, low, ancient, and commanding, echoed through the chamber. "You stand before the blade of the first. Have you come to wield it or to be judged by it?" Varos closed his hand around the hilt. Pain ripped through his body. He saw visions. Abhorash himself, cutting through endless hordes, carving his legend into the bones of the world. The first blood dragons kneeling before him, swearing to seek strength beyond the hunger. The war against the Nightmare Legion, fought long before Vokhmar rose from the grave. Then the voice came again. "You seek to slay a creature that cannot die. A lich bound in undeath, a horror beyond life. Tell me, warrior, why do you fight?" Varos did not hesitate. Because the blood dragons were meant for more than this? Because we were not meant to be puppets of hunger or slaves to false gods. Because I am not afraid. The presence within the blade seemed to listen. Then the pain vanished. Varos' grip tightened. And he knew. He was worthy. The final war awaits. Varos emerged from the tomb, the blade of Abhorash in hand, his golden eyes burning with new fire. Draskar smirked. "Did you find what you needed?" Varos looked toward the distant battlefield, where Vokhmar's army still raged, where the blood fiend still tore at its master. He tightened his grip on the weapon. "Yes, and now we end this." The final battle had begun, and Varos would deliver the blood dragon's last vengeance. Chapter 25. The Battle for Blackspire. The sky burns with the fires of war. The mountains trembled, the earth cracked, and the air itself felt thick with the weight of death. The undead army of Vokhmar, a legion that had slaughtered entire cities, now surged toward Blackspire Keep, the last bastion standing between them and the total extinction of the blood dragons. But they did not come alone. As the legion of the Crimson Lich advanced, so too did another force, one that had spent centuries hunting creatures of the night. The Empire of Sigmar had answered the call to war. And now, the final battle was not between two armies, but three. The destruction of Castle Mournfeld. Before reaching Blackspire, Vokhmar's undead marched through the valley of Mournfeld, where the kingdom of Helbrecht had ruled for nearly 200 years. King Adalric Helbrecht had sent warnings to Altdorf, had prayed at the cathedrals of Sigmar, had gathered his armies, believing his men could hold. But faith could not stop what came for them. The attack came at midnight. The air turned black with swirling shadows, the moonlight swallowed by unnatural darkness. The first gates of Mournfeld shattered beneath the weight of the Nightmare Legion, the streets drowned in an endless tide of the dead. Men fought in desperate terror, their swords breaking against flesh that did not feel pain. Crossbowmen unleashed volleys of silver-tipped bolts, only for the undead to tear through them as if they were paper. Priests of Sigmar stood upon the temple steps, calling for holy light, only to have their bodies twisted, their bones reshaped into abominations that walked among the dead. At the heart of it all, Vokhmar stood untouched, his golden eyes watching with cold amusement. Faith is nothing without strength. With a single motion of his skeletal hand, the walls of Mournfeld collapsed, and the kingdom of Helbrecht was no more. The Empire prepares for war. News of the massacre reached Altdorf within days. The witch-hunter general, Friedrich Eisenwald, stood before the gathered lords of the Empire, his scarred face grim, his voice unwavering. This is not a war between vampires. This is extermination. The hall fell silent. Every noble had heard the rumors. Every soldier had seen the signs. But this was confirmation of a nightmare none had wished to believe. Eisenwald placed both hands upon the war table, his golden eyes locked upon the map stained in ink and blood. If we do not march now, there will be no more mortal kingdoms to defend. The Emperor's advisors hesitated. Then, mobilize the armies. The forces of Sigmar march. The Empire's response was swift and brutal. From the great cities of Reikland, Middenheim, and Talapheim, legions of armored warriors rode forth, their banners raised, their war horns calling for battle. The Templars of Sigmar, the order of warrior priests who had fought vampires for centuries, rode at the front, their hammers gleaming with holy light. Behind them came the Reiksguard knights, their steel unbreakable, their swords honed for war. And at their flanks marched the great swords of Nuln, their towering blades ready to carve through the ranks of the dead. But the Empire did not march alone. Among them the witch-hunters walked, their cloaks black as midnight, their pistols loaded with silver, their faith unyielding. Friedrich Eisenwald rode at their head, his blade the light of vengeance strapped to his back, his face unreadable. He had hunted many creatures in his life, but never before had he stood against something like Vokhmar. Let them come, and we will burn them all. The crusade of the Empire had begun. The battle begins. As the Empire's legions approached Blackspire, they saw the horror before them. The fortress was already surrounded, its walls broken, its defenders fighting tooth and claw against the endless tide of undead. The blood dragons had not fallen yet, but they were one final push away from annihilation. Varos stood atop the shattered walls, his golden eyes narrowed as he saw the banners of the Empire crest the hills. Draskar growled, his fingers tightening on his blood-stained sword. "They come to kill us too, you know." Varos nodded. "They won't get the chance if we're already dead." He turned to his remaining knights, their armor cracked, their swords dulled from hours of endless battle. "Home last time. For the blood dragons." A roar of defiance echoed across the ruined fortress. And then the Empire and the Legion of the Dead collided. A war between gods and monsters. The battlefield became an inferno. Cannons of the Empire roared, blasting apart entire ranks of the undead, their bodies torn into clouds of dust and gore. Knights of the Reiksguard clashed with skeletal horrors, their blades shattering bone, their lances running through creatures that should not exist. Witch-hunters unleashed silver fire upon Volkmar's cursed warlocks, purging them in the name of Sigmar. But the dead did not break. Giant corpse knights ripped imperial war horses in half, their claws sinking through steel and flesh alike. Wraiths drifted through the battlefield, their spectral hands tearing the souls from screaming men. Templars of Sigmar fell, their prayers drowned in the howling darkness. And at the center of it all, Vokhmar walked untouched, his golden eyes glowing as he raised both hands. "You are too late." With a single motion, he called upon the full weight of his power. The dead surged forward in numbers beyond counting. The Empire's ranks wavered, and Blackspire Keep stood at the edge of oblivion. The last hope. Varos moved through the carnage, his sword carving a path through the undead, his golden eyes locked on one goal. Vokhmar. Behind him, Draskar and Isolde fought like demons, their blades flashing, their armor drenched in the blood of the dead. But Varos did not stop. He had what he needed. The relic of Abhorash burned in his grip, a weapon that could end this nightmare. Gregor had given him the final truth. Vokhmar could not be killed by steel alone. But if he could sever the blood fiend, if he could cut away Vokhmar's last true soul, then the Crimson Lich would finally die. And so, as the battle raged, as the world burned, as the Empire and the undead fought for dominion over the ruined keep, Varos charged forward. His blade raised, his oath unbroken. The final battle had begun, and this time it would end in blood. Chapter 26. The Crimson Moon Rises. A sky drenched in blood. The air was thick with the scent of war, heavy with the stench of burning flesh, ruptured organs, and the iron tang of spilled blood. The once proud walls of Blackspire Keep were now ruined battlements, their stonework shattered, their defenders reduced to little more than bloodied specters of their former selves. Yet the battle raged on. The undead tide surged, an unstoppable force of decayed knights, skeletal horrors, and abominations woven from nightmares. The Empire's forces and the last of the blood dragons stood together, their swords ringing against bone and cursed steel, their bodies pressed back against the final stronghold of mortal defiance. And above it all, the sky wept red. Morris Lieb, the cursed moon, hung heavy in the heavens, its unnatural glow washing the battlefield in a crimson light, making the war below look like a living painting of carnage and madness. The crimson moon had risen, and with it the end of an era, the onslaught of the dead. The first charge broke through the gates completely. A dozen monstrous corpse knights, their bodies fused with twisted black armor, crashed through the remains of the stronghold's defenses, their massive clawed steeds trampling soldiers into the dirt. Varos met them head-on. For Abhorash, his greatsword tore through the first knight, splitting it in two, black ichors spraying across his already ruined armor. Draskar roared like a beast, his mighty blade cleaving through 3 undead warriors at once, sending their broken bodies tumbling. Isolde danced between her enemies, her daggers flashing like silver fangs, cutting through tendons and throats in a blur of lethal precision. The Empire's greatswords hacked through the undead, their blades biting deep, but their numbers dwindled with every passing moment. They were holding the line, but barely. For every corpse they cut down, 5 more took its place. The Nightmare Legion was endless. And at the center of it all, watching with the patience of a god, stood Vokhmar, the Crimson Lich revealed. Vokhmar did not fight. He did not need to. He simply walked forward, his golden eyes burning with cold amusement, his crimson robes untouched by the carnage around him. Every step he took sent ripples through the battlefield. You struggle so desperately, Varos. You fight for a cause that was lost before you ever drew breath. Varos cut down another undead knight, his golden eyes locking onto the Lich. You are not a god, Vokhmar, and I am done listening to your empty words. Vokhmar's thin lips curled. Then let us see if you can silence me." He raised one hand. The earth trembled. The dead let out a single, unified scream. And then they moved as one, not as a mindless horde, not as a disjointed tide of walking corpses, but as an army. An unstoppable, disciplined force, their golden eyes burning with Vokhmar's will. And behind them, shadows twisted and coiled, forming something massive, something inhuman. The blood fiend. It had grown. It had fed upon war, upon death, upon betrayal. And now it was nothing less than a god of slaughter. Its golden eyes flickered, no longer mindless, no longer bound. It remembered, and it hungered. The empire breaks. The witch-hunter general, Frederick Eisenwald, had fought many wars, but never had he seen something like this. Sigmar preserve us. The Templars of Sigmar stood firm, their warhammers smashing through skeletal warriors, their holy prayers burning through wraiths like fire through dry parchment. But faith alone would not be enough. The blood fiend struck. Its massive clawed hands swept through the battlefield, hurling men into the air like broken dolls, their bones shattering before they even hit the ground. The great swords of Nuln were crushed beneath its weight. The witch-hunters fired their silver bullets into its flesh, only to watch them vanish in the black abyss of its form. The cannons of the Empire roared, only to be swallowed in an explosion of black tendrils that tore their crews apart. In moments, the right flank collapsed completely. The Empire's greatest warriors were falling. And Varos knew this was it. This was the moment where history would end, unless he ended it first. The charge of the blood dragons. Varos gripped the relic of Abhorash, feeling its power surge through his veins, his golden eyes burning with unshakable resolve. This was what he had trained for. This was why he had survived the betrayals, the wars, the nightmares. This was his final battle. Blood dragons. With me. The last of the knights roared, their bodies battered, their blades dulled, but their will unbroken. Droskar led the charge, his greatsword glowing with dark magic as he hurled himself into the dead. Isolde vanished into the shadows, her daggers hunting the warlocks who commanded the undead. The remaining blood dragons tore through the battlefield, their fangs bared, their swords singing through the air. Varos ran toward the blood fiend, his blade raised high. Vokhmar watched him without fear. "Come then, warrior. Let me show you how foolish your cause truly is." With a wave of his hand, the blood fiend turned its gaze upon Varos. Its golden eyes narrowed, and then it jogged. The ground shattered beneath its massive frame, its clawed hands reaching to tear him apart. But Varos did not slow. He did not falter. He had come too far. With one final roar, he leapt forward, the relic of Abhorash burning with power in his grasp. For the blood dragons, the final battle had begun, and only one side would leave this place alive. Chapter 27. The Lord of Undeath. The throne carved from bone. The battle for Blackspire raged, a war between gods and monsters, between the last warriors of the blood dragons and an enemy that sought to erase them from history. Varos had led the charge, his blade burning with the power of Abhorash, his knights fighting at his side in one final defiance of death itself. But Vokhmar had never been fighting for victory. He had been waiting, and now the moment had come. The ritual begins. As Varos cut through the undead, his blade cleaving through bone and rot, the sky itself seemed to twist. The crimson moon pulsed, its light growing stronger, its bloody glow consuming the heavens. The ground beneath Blackspire trembled, cracks spreading through the earth, as if the world itself was recoiling from what was to come. And at the center of it all, Vokhmar stood, untouched, unshaken, unbroken. His golden eyes burned with something beyond power. He raised his skeletal hands, and the battlefield obeyed. The dead halted. The blood fiend reared back, its monstrous form pulsing, shifting unnaturally. And then, the souls of the slain began to rise. Every knight, every warrior, every fallen blood dragon, every imperial soldier, their bodies lay where they had fallen, but their spirits were ripped from their corpses. You were all mine from the beginning. Varos turned, his golden eyes wide with fury and realization. This was not just a battle. This had never been a war for conquest. This was a feeding, a ritual to consume the blood dragon bloodline itself, and Vokhmar had set it into motion from the very start. The hunger of the false god. The sky split open. A howl erupted from the heavens, a sound that was not wind, not thunder, but something older, something unnatural. Vokhmar's form twisted, his crimson robes burning away, revealing the true horror beneath. His skeletal frame cracked apart, not in death, but in rebirth. Flesh reformed where there had been bone. His golden eyes blazed, not with magic, but with the endless hunger of something becoming more than undead. His fingers elongated, his nails blackened, his very body warping into something no longer bound by mortality or unlife. He was not becoming a god. He was becoming the last vampire, a being that held dominion over all the undead, over all those who carried the cursed blood. The final evolution of undeath itself. A predator beyond even Abhorash, the lord of undeath, and his banquet had just begun. The blood dragons resist. Varos felt it immediately. A pull in his veins, a force clawing at his soul, as if something was trying to rip him from within. He staggered, his vision swimming, his mind flooding with whispers, voices of the long dead calling to him, begging for release. Draskar fell to one knee, his sword shaking in his grip. Isolta let out a gasp, her fangs bared in agony. He's pulling us into him. The blood dragons were dying. Not from blade or spell, but from absorption. Vokhmar was consuming them. Their souls, their strength, their very existence, becoming part of his being. He had not come to fight them. He had come to erase them. Your line ends tonight, Vokhmar intoned, his voice layered with the echoes of 1,000 fallen warriors. Your honor, your code, your foolish devotion to a corpse who could not finish what I have begun. His golden eyes locked onto Varos. I will not be a warlord. I will not be a tyrant. I will be the first of a new age. And there will be no blood dragons left to challenge me. The fight against fate. Varos felt the power surging against him, his blood boiling, his soul threatening to be wrenched from his body. But he refused. He would not be taken. He gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the relic of Abhorash, feeling the weight of every oath he had ever sworn. This was not how their order would die. Not here. Not like this. Draskar. The massive knight snapped his head up, his golden eyes still flickering with pain. We sever his soul, now. Draskar let out a guttural growl, forcing himself to his feet. Now, Varos's gaze locked onto the blood fiend, the hulking monstrosity that was still bound to Vokhmar, still connected to him, still his weakness. We kill the beast, and we kill him. Vokhmar's face twisted in the closest thing to rage he had ever shown. You will not. You cannot. I am inevitable. Varos grinned, his fangs flashing. Then let's see how inevitable you are when I carve your fucking soul apart. The final charge. The battlefield erupted once more. Varos and Draskar rushed forward, their blades raised high, their final war cry shaking the heavens. The blood fiend turned toward them, its golden eyes locking onto the warriors who had dared to defy fate. It let out a monstrous roar, One last act of defiance. One last battle. One last hunt. And then they clashed. Chapter 28. The Duel of Eternal Night. The end of an age, the birth of a legend. The sky was fire and blood. The battlefield lay in ruin, the walls of Blackspire reduced to smoldering wreckage, the bodies of the fallen, undead, mortal, and blood dragon alike, strewn across the corpse-littered earth. The Empire's warriors had broken, their lines shattered, their last survivors retreating into the mountains. The blood dragons had fought to their final breath. Now there were only two left. Varos, the Crimson Fang, Vokhmar, the Lord of Undeath, and between them the fate of an entire bloodline. The final duel had begun. A war beyond flesh. Varos charged forward, his blade glowing with the power of Abhorash, its edge singing through the crimson air. Vokhmar did not retreat. He stood, waiting, his golden eyes watching with cold amusement. Then he moved. A storm of black fire erupted from his skeletal hands, racing toward Varos, tendrils of necrotic power twisting like living shadows. Varos did not slow. He brought up the relic, its blade cleaving through the magic as though it were mist, the air splitting in its wake. Their blades met. The impact shattered the very ground beneath them, sending shockwaves across the battlefield, hurling corpses into the air, splintering what remained of the keep. The force of the strike would have sundered a mortal in half. But neither of them were mortal. They were the last of their kind. And this was how they would be remembered. The dance of death. Vokhmar lashed out, his blade a blur of blackened steel, his movements unnatural, inhuman, his very form flickering between shadow and substance. Varos blocked the first strike, twisted aside the second, then parried the third with a bone-rattling clash of steel. The relic of Abhorash burned in his grasp, its power pulsing through his veins, strengthening him beyond even his blood dragon heritage. But Vokhmar was not bound by flesh. He did not tire. He did not feel pain. Every time Varos struck, Vokhmar's form shifted, his body momentarily fading into mist before reforming in a different position. You cannot kill what does not live, knight. Varos ignored the words. He would not be broken. He would not yield. He had sworn an oath to strength, and he would not fail now. The breaking of the bloodline. Then Vokhmar changed the battle. With a single gesture, he called forth the power he had been gathering since the war began. The crimson moon pulsed. The earth split open, and from beneath the battlefield the souls of every fallen blood dragon. Knights who had died at Drakenhold. Warriors who had perished in the civil war. Even the traitors who had fought under Syrian's banner. All of them rose, their golden eyes now black with undeath. Vokhmar laughed, his skeletal voice echoing through the ruins. Do you see it now? You were never meant to rule. You were meant to be part of something greater. Varos staggered, his golden eyes flickering as he saw the faces of his fallen brothers. Draskar, Isolde, even Sarian, all of them bound in death, their blades raised against him. He felt the weight of centuries of war pressing against his shoulders. The blood dragons were gone. He was the last, and Vokhmar would take even that from him. Kneel, the Lich whispered. Join them, and I will make you more than a knight. I will make you eternal. For the first time, Varos felt the temptation. It would be so easy to let go, to join the ranks of the undying, to become part of something beyond war, beyond struggle, beyond pain. But then he heard the voice of his master, Abhorash, not in words, not in whispers, but in the strength that still burned inside him. He tightened his grip on the relic, and he stood. We do not kneel. We fight, and with one final roar he charged. The killing blow. The relic of Abhorash ignited in his hands, the ancient weapon pulsing with power not felt in centuries. Vokhmar lashed out, his magic surging forward in a tide of darkness. But Varos did not stop. He drove through it, the shadowy tendrils burning away before the might of his blade. The undead blood dragons turned upon him, and he cut them down. Not in anger, not in hatred, but because they had no place in this world. Because this was not what Abhorash had intended. Because they deserved to rest. Then only Vokhmar remained, and Varos struck. The blade of Abhorash tore through the Lich's chest, splitting his form in two, severing him from the power he had stolen. Vokhmar let out a sound that was neither scream nor roar, but something in between, a wail of absolute denial. His golden eyes dimmed, his form shattered, and the crimson moon above trembled before fading from the sky. The end of the nightmare. The battlefield fell silent. The undead crumbled, their bodies turning to dust. The black flames that had burned across the ruins of Blackspire vanished. And for the first time in centuries, the night was still. Varos stood in the silence, his body broken, his sword still embedded in the earth where Vokhmar had fallen. He looked around. The blood dragons were gone. The empire had retreated. The war was over. But he had won. He was the last of his kind, the final blood dragon. And as he stood beneath the quiet night sky, he lifted his sword once more, not in triumph, but in remembrance, in honor, because as long as he still stood, as long as his blade still moved, the blood dragons would never truly die. Chapter 29. The End of the War. A broken throne, a dying king. The sky above Blackspire was no longer red. The crimson moon had faded, swallowed by the night, its ominous glow no longer tainting the heavens. The war was over, but the battlefield remained. The ruins of Blackspire Keep were silent, the once great fortress reduced to rubble, its banners torn, its walls crumbling into dust. The undead had fallen. The empire had withdrawn. And in the center of it all, Varos stood alone, bleeding, dying, but victorious. The Lord of Undeath falls. Where Vokhmar had once stood, there was nothing but ash. The Crimson Lich, the monster that had sought to consume the blood dragons, was no more. His golden eyes had dimmed, his soul severed, his body unmade by the relic of Abhorash. The power that had bound his legions together had collapsed. Without him, his army had crumbled. The blood fiend, the monstrous extension of his cursed soul, had disintegrated upon his death, its rotting flesh collapsing into blackened mist. The thousands of undead warriors, the twisted knights and wraiths that had marched at his command, had turned to dust where they stood. The war that had burned across the border princes for decades had finally ended. But victory had come at a cost. The final wound. Varos stood amid the wreckage, his hand pressed against his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood soaking through his armor. Vokhmar had struck him before the end. A final attack, a last, desperate curse woven into his blackened blade. The wound would not heal. Not with immortal blood, not with time, not with magic. It was a killing blow, slow and patient, crafted with the same sorcery that had made the Lich what he was. Varos could feel it spreading. A dull ache at first, a creeping coldness that gnawed at his flesh, then at his veins, then at his very soul. So, this is how it ends? His voice was hoarse, his fangs bared in pain, but his lips curled in something almost resembling a smile. Not a smile of relief, not even one of defiance, but one of acceptance. He had always known his path would end in blood. And now, His war was over. But there was still one thing left to do. The last survivors. Footsteps echoed through the ruins. Varos turned slowly, his golden eyes dimming, as he saw the last remnants of his order approaching. Draskar the Dread, still standing despite the wounds across his chest, his sword dragging behind him, too heavy for even his monstrous strength. Isolde the Silent, her daggers shattered, her face streaked with blood, her expression unreadable. Gregor the Hollow, coughing up blackened blood, his eyes flickering with the last embers of his stolen magic. They had survived, but only barely. Gregor staggered toward Varos, his ruined robes dragging behind him. "You're dying," the necromancer muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Varos let out a breath, slow and heavy. Yes. Draskar let out a guttural snarl, slamming his fist against a broken wall. "For all of this?" Varos chuckled softly. "We were never meant to live forever, brother. Not truly. A warrior's choice." Gregor knelt beside him, his skeletal fingers tracing runes in the air. "I can hold back the curse. Bind your soul to something, anything, a weapon, a body, a throne. You don't have to die." Varos met his gaze. For a long moment he was silent. Then he shook his head. "No, Abhorash did not walk this path for us to become like them. We were meant to be warriors, not gods, not kings, not things that refuse to die." He gripped the relic of Abhorash, feeling its power flicker in his grasp. "I will not become another Vokhmar." Gregor's expression darkened, but he did not argue. Draskar's fists clenched, his rage barely contained. Isolde simply watched. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Draskar growled. "Then what do we do now?" Varos exhaled slowly. Then he turned his gaze toward the last survivors of the blood dragons. "You live. You rebuild. The blood dragons are not dead. Not yet. You will not bow to a throne. You will not serve a master. You will not seek power for the sake of power. You will walk the path as Abhorash did. In strength and purpose." His vision blurred, his body weakening, his grip on the blade loosening. "Promise me." "Swear it." Gregor was the first to speak. "I swear." Then Draskar, his fangs bared, his voice trembling with anger and grief. "I swear it." Then Isolde, her whisper barely audible. "I swear." Varos smiled. "Good." And then he fell. The death of the last lord. The wind moved through the ruins, carrying the scent of ash and blood. Varos lay upon the shattered stones of Blackspire, his golden eyes staring into the sky. For the first time in centuries he saw the stars. Not the red moon. Not the smoke of burning cities. Just the night sky. Just the world as it had always been. His grip loosened. The relic of Abhorash slipped from his fingers. And finally he closed his eyes. Varos the Crimson Fang, the last lord of Drakenhold, the greatest of the blood dragons, was dead. The legacy remains. The last of the blood dragons stood in silence. Gregor bowed his head in respect. Draskar knelt, pressing his sword into the ground, his teeth clenched, his rage contained but not forgotten. Isolde simply watched, her expression unreadable, her eyes lingering on the fallen lord for a long, long time. Then they turned. The war was over, but the path remained. And as they stepped away from the ruins of Blackspire, disappearing into the night, one truth remained. The blood dragons were not dead. Not as long as their legend endured. Not as long as warriors still walked the earth with strength and honor. Not as long as Varos' name was spoken. His body was gone. His war was finished. But his story would never end. Chapter 30. Blood and Ashes. a war without victory. The border princes would never be the same again. The war of the blood dragons, a conflict of betrayal, vengeance, and slaughter, had ended in ruin. But there was no victor. The undead hordes of Vokhmar had been broken, their master destroyed, his dark will finally severed from the world. Yet the blood dragons had not triumphed. They had been scattered to the wind, their once great brotherhood shattered beyond repair. Drakenhold was a smoldering ruin. Blackspire Keep was a corpse of stone, its walls reduced to rubble, its halls filled with the bones of fallen knights. The Empire would see to it that neither stronghold would rise again. The war was over. But the cost was more than blood and stone. It was the death of a legacy. The vanishing of the last lord. Varos had been the last true lord of the blood dragons, the one who had held the line, who had refused to kneel, who had fought until the bitter end. But when the dust settled, when the bodies of the fallen had cooled, when the sky no longer wept blood, he was gone. His body had not been found among the ruins of Blackspire. The relic of Abhorash had vanished with him. Some said he had died with his sword in his hand, his body claimed by the battlefield itself, dissolving into legend. Others whispered that his soul had been taken by something older than even death, that he had been chosen for something beyond mortal understanding. But the blood dragons knew the truth. Varos was not dead. He had simply become more than a man. He had become a story, a whisper carried in the wind, a name spoken in the dark, a warning to those who sought to claim the blood dragon's legacy for themselves, a phantom that would haunt the nightmares of vampires and mortals alike. The Crimson Fang still rides, and he will return when the world needs him most. The blood dragons are no more. With their lord gone, the blood dragons had no leader, and so they did what they had always done. They vanished. Draskar the Dread rode north, disappearing into the mountains of Kislev, his blade seeking new battles, new wars, refusing to let the blood dragons be forgotten. Isolde the Silent was never seen again, though rumors spoke of a black-cloaked warrior haunting the courts of Bretonnia, hunting those who dared claim the name of knight unworthy. Gregor the Hollow returned to the darkness, his magic drained, his body broken, but his knowledge of the war's truth preserved, hidden away for those who might one day need it. And the others? Some buried themselves in the Empire, hiding in the shadows, watching from afar. Some fled to the chaos wastes, seeking death in battles they could never win. Some simply disappeared, and so the order that had once defied the world was gone. Not truly dead, but scattered to the winds, their names spoken only in hushed tones, their legacy nothing more than a ghost of what it once was. The Empire comes to claim the ruins. The armies of the Empire marched upon the border princes not as conquerors, but as purifiers. The witch-hunter general, Friedrich Eisenwald, stood at the ruins of Drakenhold, staring at the broken gates, the blackened stones, the remnants of the blood dragon civil war. He had fought in many wars, but this had been something worse. He turned to his Templars of Sigmar, his voice cold, unshaken. Burnett. The holy pyres of the Empire lit the sky, cleansing the battlefields, raising what remained of Drakenhold and Blackspire, ensuring no vampire would ever reclaim these cursed places. They found no sign of Varos. They found no relics of Abhorash. All they left behind were ruins and ashes, and for the Empire that was enough. The blood dragons are gone. Let the border princes never forget the war of the vampires. Legends never die, but wars do not end with fire, nor do they end with silence. For though Drakenhold was gone, though the blood dragons had fallen, though the Empire had erased their name from history, the world still remembered. Travelers spoke of a knight clad in blood-red armor, a warrior who fought alone against things that should not exist. A phantom in the night, a ghost of war, a shadow that rode upon the wind. Some believed he was a spirit, lingering beyond death. Some believed he was a man, waiting for a time when the world needed him again. And some believed he had never been mortal at all. Only one truth remained. The blood dragons had been scattered. The war had ended, but their legacy would never die. For as long as the strong still fought, as long as warriors still rose against the darkness, the Crimson Fang would never truly be forgotten. And one day, when the world needed a monster to fight monsters once more, Varos would return,